Chapter 51. Nick Smith, Adventurer Level 7, Human, American. That'll do. Nash nodded at my hunched-over form. Take a breather. Oh, okay, I said, between desperate gasps for air. Nash had once again landed one of his signature kicks directly to my diaphragm. I was beginning to suspect that he had unlocked a skill similar to my Breathtaker strike. This time, though, I managed to poke my training sword into his ribs before he landed it. With a growing pride in myself, I collapsed into a sitting position and watched the countdowns for my cooldowns. It had taken every single one of my non-magical skills just to land that one strike, and it hadn't slowed him down a bit. I sighed, remembering our first sparring session. I'd managed to unlock Breathtaker strike and land it against him. It had stopped the session immediately, but I've pretty much been getting my ass kicked ever since. I'm not sure Nash is aware of it, but he's been getting stronger too. Every time I think I've gotten strong enough or fast enough to match him, he manages to pull ahead. Or maybe he's still just pulling his punches, and I'm too inexperienced to realize it. Either way, I'd hate to get into a real fight against him. Would you care to try some magic? Yulk interrupted my thoughts with a toothy smile. Sure, I said, looking up at him. What kind of magic do you have in mind? He reached out to help me up, and I took his hand without putting too much of my weight on him. Yulk has a bad back, and sending him toppling wouldn't be very nice. However, he ignored my generosity and pulled me to my feet fast enough for said feet to leave the ground for a moment. If I recall correctly, you have access to several spells already. Wind Spear, Earthen Dagger, Fireball Light, Heal and Minor Heal, right? I checked my skills list and nodded. I didn't really get a chance to use most of these spells outside of some quick training that we'd done. None of my spells had even leveled up, and most of them are useless. Fireball sounds like it would be the best of the spells, but the heat it outputs is uncomfortable to work with. Earthen Dagger would be better if it summoned a sword instead of a little knife. Finally, Heal can magically mend my wounds, but I already have 10 for that. 10 can do it without using my magic too. I'd like to teach you a spell that many have trouble with, he continued. It's called Ice Javelin. You have to visualize the moisture in the air coming together and forming a magically enhanced icicle. Okay, I said as I lifted my arms and aimed at a nearby tree. I pictured all the water molecules in the air coming together to form the condensation on the outside of a cold drinking glass. I imagined all that condensation moving into the shape of an icicle and freezing, then felt my magic shoot through my arms. The air in front of my fingertips grew cold and mist began to gather together. Suddenly, the mist began to form a cone of ice. Nilevai etitsak. The icicle slammed into a nearby tree with enough force to make it shudder. Ice Javelin unlocked. Yulk and I looked at each other, then walked over to the tree. It was pretty thick. My arms wouldn't even fit around it, but the projectile had managed to go through it enough to poke out of the other side. Yulk let out a low whistle. Like that? I asked with a dash of smugness. Yeah, he laughed. Exactly like that. Cool, pun intended. So why haven't you tried to teach me this spell before? Because I didn't know it. Olmira taught it to me the day before we left, he said, gesturing behind me. Took me all day. I turned and was met with a wide-eyed and open-mouthed stare. Olmira's eyes darted back and forth between myself and the tree. See, Yulk said to her with a grin. He's able to learn new things much faster than most people. Yes, I see, she replied. But how? I glanced at Yulk, who returned my gaze. The place I come from had mandatory public education, I answered, so a lot of these concepts aren't new to me. Maybe that's why I'm able to pick things up so fast. The sorceress pair stared at me for a moment. What sort of subjects are covered by this public education? Olmira asked. Math, science, social studies, languages, writing, woodshop, all sorts of things. Woodshop? My guess would be carpentry, milady, judging solely by the name, of course. Yulk laughed. Oh my, Nash is beginning to look impatient. Shall we be off? I gave Yulk a confused glance. Ever since Olmira joined us, it seems like Yulk had upped his eloquence. While it's true he wasn't exactly brash before, I don't remember him ever using the word shall. On the other hand, I could be imagining things. or 10 could be playing with the translations. I looked toward Nash and immediately forgot about Yulk's odd word choices. His pack was already in the cart, and he was practically glowering at us. "Yeah, let's go," I quickly agreed. We packed our things and loaded back into the cart. Imlaw gave us a smile and we continued our journey. I leaned into the corner of the cart and accessed my skills list, selecting the option for physical skills. Time Dilation 2 increases the user's speed to 150% for a limited time. Cooldown 4 minutes. Dash 2. Move forward up to 8 feet at 300% speed. Cooldown 1 minute. Breathtaker Strike 2. A strike that robs your opponent of their ability to breathe. Cooldown 45 seconds. Power Slash 1. Amplifies the user's striking power by 100%. Cooldown 1 minute. Slide Slash 1. Slide along the ground and strike with 100% amplified striking power. Cooldown 1 minute. Preternatural Evasion 1 allows a user to automatically dodge for 1 minute. Cooldown 10 minutes. Knife Hand hardens a user's hand into a knife-like shape. Can apply intimidation to lower-level enemies. Duration 1 minute. Cooldown 5 minutes. The cooldowns for both Breathtaker Strike and Time Dilation had decreased. It was previously 1 minute and 5 minutes, respectively. The distance that I can dash increased by 2 feet as well. The buffs weren't as good as I had hoped they would be, but the skills had leveled up faster than I'd expected. I decided to get a look at my spells list, too. Wind Spear 1. Summon a spear of wind to strike your target. Earthen Dagger Y. Summon a blade of earth. Duration 5 minutes. Cooldown 10 minutes. Fireball Y. Summon a ball of fire to strike your target. Cooldown 5 minutes. Heal Y. Heal your superficial wounds. Minor Heal. Heal your target's superficial wounds. Ice Javelin 1. Summon a javelin of ice to strike your target. Cooldown 5 minutes. Light. Summons an orb that emits a moderate amount of light until the user dismisses it or falls unconscious. I really need to start leveling these up. Unfortunately, fighting takes a lot of my energy, and Nash is a little greedy when it comes to my training time. I guess that's fair. Our current party consists of 2 magic users, 1 multi-class, and a fighter. I guess there's also Imlaw, but as far as I know, he doesn't have any skills that are useful in a fight. If I were to join Yulk and Olmyra in casting spells, that would leave Nash alone on our front line. That's not a good position to be in, even with magical backup. It's too easy to get flanked, and as Nash himself says, if you're flanked, you're fucked. I had to stifle a laugh. Look at me, suddenly an expert in battle tactics. Before I came here, I knew almost nothing about real fighting. I played video games, but not enough to glean anything from them. I also fought in some karate tournaments, but those have rules and regulations to keep people safe. Real fights don't. The sound of a page turning tore me from these thoughts. I turned toward the sound and saw Yulk reading the book that Imlaw had given him before we set off for Bolisir. The Musings of Gralv, a book about the Fae written by an imp. Is it any good? I asked him. Nope, he laughed. It's absolutely terrible. His grammar and word choice are abysmal, and it's rare that he spells words correctly. Actually, I'm quite certain that he's found new ways to misspell some of these words. That being said, it's a rather interesting subject given our experiences thus far. You mean with the Arch Fay? Yes, Algebran and... He trailed off and glanced at Olmyra. And tits. Nash finished his sentence for him. Pardon? Olmyra asked. Nash and I started laughing as Yulk turned a darker shade of green. Well, when I told you about our encounter with the Fae, you'll recall that I left out the names that Nick gave them, Yulk explained. I named one of them Algebran, and the other one wanted to be named Tits, I added. Oh, I see, Olmyra said. Yeah, she was quite the character. Anyway, what's so interesting about what Gralv wrote? I asked. Yulk looked thankful at the change in topic and put a bookmark in between the pages he was reading. Well, in this story, he spent a summer with the Fae and interviewed as many as he could. Eventually, he got curious as to why all of the Fae he spoke to were female. and one of the Fae revealed that they chose their forms based on many factors. In his case, they were trying to convince him to extend his stay indefinitely and help make more Fae. Oh, yes, though I'm not certain I believe it. He continues to explain the process in which Fae couple with mortals in excruciating detail, though it very much reads like a soldier or guard bragging to his friends about a fictional romantic encounter. He then explains that Fae are also able to couple with certain magical plants and spirits, which lends a bit of credibility to his claims, because this is the method of procreation that those who are familiar with the Fae know of. So they can make babies with anything, I asked with fear in my voice. Is Tits going to cause a population crisis? That's unlikely, Yulk laughed. New Fae cannot be created without the explicit consent of the mating partner. If their partner does not want to create a new Fae, even subconsciously, one will not be created. He doesn't explain how this works with plants, unfortunately. So what else does he... Nash started to say before trailing off. Do the rest of you hear that? I raised an eyebrow at him, but after a moment I heard a dull rumbling sound in the distance. We looked around but couldn't see what was causing the sound until our cart turned a corner. To our right was a forest, and to our left were plains that were being ravaged by a tornado. We watched the storm in a shocked silence. It was breathtakingly massive, ripping up everything around it. The giant funnel was extending from a large cloud, which was also the only cloud in the sky. I was about to ask if that's normal when Nash stood up, putting his hand on Imlor's shoulder. Imlor, get us out of here, he said. Don't have to tell me twice, Imlor said, urging the Narses to pick up their pace. Nash nearly toppled over as the cart began to speed along the road. He took a knee, and we watched the tornado nervously, silently praying that it didn't start coming toward us. Lightning struck the ground near the tornado, and a few seconds later thunder shook everything around us. Is that normal? I asked. Do tornadoes usually appear from a singular cloud? No, Elmira said quietly. What's going on then? I don't know. Wait a minute, Yulk said. Isn't this where we encountered... He was interrupted by the cart coming to a sudden stop. Before anyone could ask Imlor what was going on, a loud roar drowned out the sounds of the distant storm. I stood to see what was happening and saw a bear-shaped creature in the middle of the road a few yards ahead of us. Instead of fur, though, it had scales that were completely black. Its claws glimmered like 5 razor-sharp daggers in the sunlight. I grabbed my sword as it roared again and leapt from the cart with Nash close behind me. We took position in front of the cart, trying to protect Imlor and the Hnarses. The bear lizard rose onto its hind legs and roared once more, louder this time. The fuck is that thing? I asked. It's an Urzan, Nash explained. They're tough. Go for the gut or the throat. Don't bother with the chest or head. Understood, I said. Nash charged forward, and I quickly followed him. A wind spear flew over our heads and barely missed the Urzan, who dropped to all fours and began charging us. As Nash and I got closer, I used dash to get ahead of him and swung my sword at the Urzan's neck with power slash. Time seemed to slow down as my blade approached the monster. It looked like it was going to be a good slash, and I began contemplating how I would avoid a counterattack. But as my blade made contact with the Urzan's neck, it suddenly disappeared with a balloon-like pop. My sword struck the ground and I stood there stunned, wondering what the hell just happened. I barely managed to catch a glimpse of something fleshy heading toward my face, but before I could react, I was enveloped in a flower-scented squishiness. Arms locked my head in place as I dropped my sword and began to struggle. Nick! A muffled but familiar feminine voice shouted. Chapter 52. Nick Smith, Adventurer Level 7, Human American. I've missed you so much, the voice shouted. Bulp, I replied, struggling to breathe. My sword dropped to the ground as I grabbed at the arms that were trapping my head. I struggled for a few moments and finally released myself, taking a few heavy breaths. Once my breathing calmed down, I looked up to find Tits grinning widely at me, her almost teal-colored eyes shimmering in the sunlight. My peripheral vision managed to warn me to maintain eye contact with her, and my face went beet red. What the fuck? I asked, desperately pretending not to notice her clothing situation. Were you trying to suffocate me? Only if you're into that, she said with a wink. Nash placed a hand on my shoulder and gently pulled me behind him. I picked up and sheathed my sword, trying not to catch a glimpse of the Arch Fay while I did so. "Why are you nude?" he asked. "It's such a wonderful day out, how could I not be?" she replied. "Not that wonderful of a day," Nash said as he pointed to the tornado. "Oh, that?" she giggled. "Don't worry about that, it's just Mummel Dobran having a conniption." Nash and I shared a concerned expression, which made Tits laugh. Before we could say anything about these concerns, Algebran appeared behind her. "Causing trouble again?" he asked. "Me? Never," Tits replied with a grin. "I was just giving Nick a friendly hello." "Little too friendly," I muttered. "Sounds about right," Algebran smiled. "Did Tits reveal the reason we've interrupted your journey?" "No," I said as Yulk, Olmyra, and Imlor jogged up to us. The two Archfey noticed our approaching companions, and their smiles faded. They gave each other a worried glance. "You think that's going to be a problem?" Tits asked quietly. "I don't know," Algebran answered. "Hopefully not." "What's going on?" I asked. The pair exchanged a few whispers before Algebran turned back to me with a somber expression. "We'll start with why we're here. The reason that we stopped you is because we need you to testify on our behalf," he explained. "Testify? Like in a court?" When I said the word court, they both flinched like parents who just heard their toddler swear for the first time. In a crowded but quiet public place. "No, not a—" Algebran hesitated. "More like a hearing. What happened between us has raised a lot of questions, and the purpose of the hearing is to find answers to those questions. Nobody is in trouble." "Yet," Tits said with a pointed glance at Olmyra, "you're keeping rather interesting company these days, Nick. Do you know that's a vampire?" The seriousness in her voice combined with her nudity nearly made me laugh. I avoided looking directly at her and thought about how to reply. After a moment of silence, I turned back toward her and looked her directly in the eyes. "Do I know that the oddly youthful and powerful sorcerer named Olmyra the Eternal, who also happens to drink blood, is a vampire?" I asked sarcastically. "No. How could I have ever guessed?" "Ooh, you become twice as cute when you get saucy." She winked and gave herself a squeeze that made me blush and look away. "Hot." "Put some clothes on," Algebran chided. "Is my vampirism an issue?" Olmyra asked hesitantly. "Of course it is." Algebran turned to her with a scowl. "We would have smote you the moment we saw you, were Nick not acting as your traveling companion." "What?" I asked, shocked. "Why?" "To use terms you're more familiar with, vampires are possessed by the souls of the damned," Algebran explained. "As are all undead, for that matter. These souls are actually magical beings like fae or fairies that have twisted and corrupted themselves by intentionally breaking the laws that bind us, simply to satisfy their whims and petty ambitions. Once their corruption causes them to be killed, and it always does, they are forced to take the form of an undead. This how they serve penance for their crimes. We can see their sin," Tits added. "To us, it's as plain as the nose on your face." "But why discriminate against those who didn't have a choice, though?" Yulk asked. "It isn't as if it is typical for someone to request being turned into a vampire." "Oh, is that a fact?" Algebran asked pointedly. "If you were better versed on the subject, you would know that not all who are bitten by vampires turn into vampires. Some just die, and this is because before the malicious magical being possesses them, it gives them a choice. Become corrupted with its sins and roam the lands as a shadow of their former self, or simply die with only their own sins to bear." "That's not exactly a good choice to have to make," I said. "You can't really blame them for not wanting to die." "They still die, Nick," Algebran's tone softened a little. "When a mortal chooses to become corrupted, their own spiritual energies merge with that of the magical being, and they become an entirely different being. The only reason that vampires and the like are able to keep pretending to be the mortal in question is because the flesh maintains its memories. On top of that, the mortals that choose corruption are able to see the sins of the malicious spirit, just as we are. And all of this has to be explained to them in excruciating detail, so make no mistake, this is an informed choice. There can be no deception involved." If they know what they are going to become, why do people choose to become vampires? The mortal mind is a mystery to things like me. But judging from my knowledge of your own experiences, I would say hope is the most likely culprit. Hope that your spirit will overcome their spirit, that some piece of you will live on within them and help them make the right choices. Or maybe straight-up spite, depending on the person. I glanced at Elmira, who was staring firmly at the ground with her fists clenched. Nash and Imlaw were looking away from her uncomfortably, as if she had just been stripped bare in front of us. Yulk, on the other hand, was rubbing his chin, deep in thought. So how do they become cleansed of this sin? Yulk asked. Undead are immune to the rigors of time, aren't they? That is up to higher beings, the ones you call gods. They measure the weight of the individual's sins and decide what variety of undead they will become. The undead are considered enemies by all living races, and as such are frequently slain. If they have served enough penance for their misdeeds by the time they are slain, they are reborn free of corruption. If they haven't repented fully or have committed more sin, they are reborn as an undead once again. If they serve their penance, what are they reborn as? Fae, fairies, sprites, etc. Maybe even mortals, but as far as I'm aware, that's just a legend. But not all magical beings are benevolent. Are those doomed to become undead once they die? Your version of benevolence is not universal. Even the blood and bone fae and fairies have laws they must abide by. As long as they follow those laws, they are free of sin in the eyes of those above our station. Yeah, well, this has been an absolutely riveting conversation, Tits said as she waved a hand and finally became clothed. But we came here for a reason, and it wasn't to explain the ins and outs of vampirism. That is true, Algebron nodded. However, it would be foolish to escort them into the forest along with a vampire. Even if we were to forbid violence against her, there are those who believe in the cycle enough to take matters into their own hands. They would also be well within their rights to do so. I can guard the cart, Elmira said softly. Are you sure? Yulk asked. We can probably protect you. You genuinely cannot, Algebron replied tersely. Even if it were within your capabilities to defend her from the fair folk, which it isn't, the corrupted do not have the right of self-defense under our laws. Meaning that if I were to try to intercede on her behalf, you would be committing assault or murder. This would result in your arrest if you aren't killed outright. I will remain at the cart, Elmira said. Yeah, me too, Imlaw added. No offense intended, but I'm looking to get home in one piece. And the fair folk have a somewhat grim reputation among my kind. Merchants or gnomes? Tits asked with a laugh. Both, actually. Yeah, fair enough. Algebron, you want to leave them with some reinforcements, or should I? I'll do it, Algebron said, raising his hand. Reedlos, lanret tsak. An icy chill crept through the air as red energy leapt from his hand and began to form the shape of a person. Once the magic finished taking shape, a crack rang through the air that made me jump. We suddenly found ourselves joined by a fae in crimson armor. Its glowing red eyes made its coal-colored skin seem even darker. Its left hand held the longest sword I had ever seen, and in its right hand was black rock. Even I felt magic stirring within that rock. Must be an arcane focus. I turned to Algebron and raised an eyebrow. This is a simulacrum of a blood fae, he explained. While I have actual blood fae under my command, I will not force them into the position of deciding between my commands and their beliefs. Yeah, that's probably smart, I said. What happens if a fae stumbles upon the cart, though? Won't you get in trouble if your spell hurts them? Oh, I'll be casting a spell on it that will make it unnoticeable to all thinking creatures, Tits answered with a smile. The spell wears off when whoever is inside of it calls out to someone on the outside of it. Or if I want it to. What do we need the blood fae for, then? Nash asked. There are creatures that don't think, brother, Yulk said. Oh, right. Yulk helped Elmira back into the cart as Imlaw took his seat. Yulk, Nash, and I grabbed our bags and rejoined Tits and Algebron. Tits cleared her throat and held up her hand. Emimit Natsak, she said. The spell took effect instantly. I tried to focus on the cart, but I could no longer really see it. Whenever I tried to look directly at it, My gaze wandered and I forgot what I was doing. It was a very unsettling experience. There, your friends are secure and the cart is protected, Algebron said. Let's be off. What about Mummeldobran? I asked, gesturing at the distant tornado. It's best to let them vent their frustrations. They'll join us once they're done. I nodded and we followed the two Arch Fay off of the road and into the woods. Before long, the woods became a forest and the leaves of the trees began to blot out the sun. It took a bit for my eyes to adjust to the darkness. Once they did, I saw that the bushes and brambles that would have hindered our movement seemed to lean out of our way. As we ventured deeper and deeper, the sounds of the tornado became more and more muffled until they disappeared entirely. That's when I realized that the only sounds I could hear were the creaking and groaning of the foliage moving. I looked around and noticed some birds, but instead of announcing our presence, they were staring at us. The deeper we went, the more animals I noticed, and all of them silently watched us pass. An eerie chill ran down my spine. I can't help but feel as if we aren't exactly welcome here, Nash said. Nonsense, Tits said with a smile. If you weren't welcome, you'd have been ripped apart by now. Sure, but the locals don't appear to be particularly happy to see us. Well, it's complicated. Algebron, you're better at explaining things. Algebron let out a heavy sigh and looked over his shoulder at Nash. I'm sorry, Nash. It would seem that I did not properly convey the gravity of our situation, he said. Arch Fay are very special beings. We have connections with divinity that open up many of the world's deepest and darkest secrets to us, so that we may properly guide the fair folk. However, even with all this knowledge at our disposal, neither Tits nor myself can account for how we were made into Arch Fay. Well, it happened when Nick named you, didn't it? Yulk asked. That's not likely to be a coincidence. True, but even so, it doesn't make sense. An Arch Fay is not made, it's ordained. There are only two known ways for an Arch Fay to come to be. Either the Fay nobility pool their powers to imbue a named Fay with enough power to make the necessary divine connections, or the divine themselves forge these connections. Nick is gifted with plenty of magic in his core, but he doesn't even have a tenth of the magical power that a single Fay noble has, let alone a higher being. So, I paused. A god made you both Arch Fay, not me. That's what we're trying to figure out, sweetie, Tits giggled. The higher beings usually have a specific goal in mind when they make an Arch Fay, and they never make two at once. When we ask, we're met with confusion. When other Fay ask, they're met with derision. This means that even the higher beings don't know what happened or why. Obviously, this requires a thorough investigation, which is where the hearing comes in, Algebron said. You'll be meeting with some of the kings of the fair folk, who will be asking you questions about our interaction. Kings? I asked, a little bit of fear leaking into my voice. Yes, but don't worry. This is an informal hearing, Algebron laughed, seemingly reading my mind. You'll be speaking as equals, despite the airs that some of them will put on. Don't use honorifics, especially gendered ones, and don't speak out of turn. Don't say sir or mum? Why not? The physical form of a Fay is not an indication of gender or sex. We lack both, in fact, and it can be taken as an offense to assume otherwise. Algebron sighed. Thought that's just one of the many tiresome tricks that you mortals frequently fall for. It's such an old trick that there's even rules surrounding it. If the mortal is unaware that you're a fair folk, you cannot feign offense at being addressed with a gendered pronoun. Even if they are aware, they are still allowed to use most gendered pronouns so long as you are presenting as that sex. Unless it's an honorific. If you call a fair folk sir or ma'am, they'll probably demand satisfaction. If you're lucky, it'll one of your material possessions. That's actually in the book, Yulk whispered to me. You can call me ma'am if you want to. Tits winked at me. That's okay, I said. What kind of kings will we be meeting? That's not entirely clear yet. Mummeldobran, the king of Arch Fay, will be there. Ylf, the king of flower fairies, will also be attending. The Dark Ones are still battling it out to see who they're sending. Basinoth, king of the Blood Fay, or Horth, king of the Bone Fay, would be the most likely participants. Maybe both, seeing as how they frequently fight to a draw. Tamithi will also be there, Tits added. King of the Sprites. Tamithi isn't actually part of the hearing, though. They're just curious about what's going on. Algebran shrugged. We're nearing our destination. We fell into silence and continued walking until we came onto a clearing. A colossal tree stood in the center of said clearing, glowing with magical energies. I recognized it from Algebran's memories, the tree of life that births new fair folk. Between us and the tree were branches that had warped to form desks and chairs. There were 2 rows of 10 facing each other. Algebran gestured to them. Sit, we'll begin soon, he said. Chapter 53. Horth, Adventurer level, not applicable. Bone Fay King, Deep Wild Forest. I watched with anticipation as the dust from our attacks began to clear. A convenient gust of wind helped speed things along, and soon Basinoth and I were able to meet each other's eyes. Spears of bone and blood impaled the ground around us. We simultaneously slouched as we realized that we had once again remained unscathed by each other's attacks. Bah, Basinoth said, waving a hand dismissively. I'm willing to call it a draw if you are. We can drain each other's magic and come no closer to a final decision. You are most likely correct, I admitted. Fine, a draw it is. Again, I suppose we'll both take part in the hearing. Thank the High Ones, a shrill voice shouted from beneath a toppled tree. A little help, please. Basinoth and I shared a look of exasperation. The both of us had warned the King of Bone Fairies against spectating our battle. I walked over to the tree and lifted it, allowing Hul to escape its crushing embrace. It wasted no time taking to the air and hovered a few inches from my face. Why must your battles be so destructive? Hul demanded, gesturing to the new clearing that had formed within the forest. Can't you play stone, leather, dagger instead? Even if we did, we would always select the same option, I explained. Consider this a demonstration of our frustration. Venting, as it were. Surely there are less destructive ways to vent the frustrations built up from your impotent rivalry. Perhaps I'll obtain a coin from a mortal, and you can use that instead. We have tried games of chance, Hul, Basinoth said. Dice will land cocked, and coins will land upon their sides. The High Ones have decided that we are to be equally matched, and they seem to take some sadistic satisfaction in forcing the impossible to happen, in making certain we remain that way. The forest will heal, Hul, and I've heard enough chatter, I interrupted. Let us be off, Basinoth. I detest tardiness and wish to set an example for our peers. Right, let's go. I wish to see the mortals that made an Arch Fay, Hul grinned. No, you lost your fight against Yilf, Basinoth pointed out. You do not have the right to attend the hearing. I'm not going to attend. I'm just going to watch. I heard that one of the mortals is strange. Neither elf, nor orc, nor dwarf, nor, any of the other races. It's got flat ears. As if we want to listen to you prattle on for the entire journey. Travel separately if you must watch the hearing. I don't want to travel alone. Come on, I'll be quiet. Please. Be quiet? I asked, my jawbone contorting to form a grin. Is such a feat even possible for a tooth fairy? How dare you? Hull demanded, puffing up in anger. I expect such slurs from Blood Fay, even other fairies, but you? I'll have you know that I collect much more than just teeth. Finger bones, feet bones, even the little bones in ears. Oh, my grin widened. And exactly how many of these bones do you currently have in your collection? Hul's eyes narrowed at me, and Basinoth began to laugh. It is common knowledge that the King of Bone Fairies prefers bargaining to violence, and teeth are the only bones that mortals are somewhat willing to part with, especially the temporary teeth of the young. I began to walk, and Hul hurried after me indignantly, muttering obscenities under its breath. Basinoth and I made our way towards the Tree of Life as Hull began ranting about the unfairness of my question. Whenever the raving began to die down, one of us would laugh, and it would cause it to begin anew. The distance was vast, though, and eventually Hul forgot about my insult. So, why are the two of you evenly matched to begin with? Hul asked. It seems like a fairly arbitrary thing for the High Ones to desire, let alone enforce. It is because I am the embodiment of life, and Horth is the embodiment of death, Basinoth explained. We are destined to rage against each other, yet neither can claim victory over the other. Not while we actually exist, at any rate. That doesn't make sense. If a living being became immortal, they'd be immune to death, right? So life would continue to exist, wouldn't it? Wrong, I answered with a chattering chuckle. There is no such thing as true immortality among the living. Even if there were, the very act of becoming immortal wrenches them from the chains of life, and one cannot call such a being living. Even if that weren't the case, death would still have the last laugh at their expense. The very world upon which we tread will one day die, and where will they be then? They will be left desperately praying for death to whomever will listen, Basinoth said. Mortals are such fleeting things, and their longing for immortality only serves to prove this. If they were allowed to mature for a few thousand years, they would realize the folly of such desires. Do you think we'll want to die one day? Because of this conversation, I already do. I clicked my teeth in laughter. Oh, come on, seriously though, we're immortal, aren't we? No, we aren't, I answered. We are able to perish. While it's true that the cycle of fairness allows us to retake physical form if that happens, we lose who we are in the process. Death is not simply a loss of one's body, it is a loss of being. The King of Bone Fairies contemplated silently, while the King of Blood Fay studied me with pursed lips as we walked. I met their gaze and tilted my skull in a silent query. Are you going to get dressed? Basinoth asked. You look like a naked lich. I looked down and realized I had not yet applied flesh to my form. With a sigh, I began the process of covering my wonderful skeleton with mediocre and completely cosmetic meat. Nearly all beings find my true physical appearance threatening or otherwise disturbing. Long ago, a mortal pointed out to me that this must make me lonely. I wholeheartedly agreed and replied that was the point. I prefer solitude. Once the bloodless tissue had bonded and tightened to my precious bones, I looked back at Basinoth. Is this adequate? I asked. Going for the androgynous look? Basinoth replied, pointing at my chest. I looked down again and noticed that it looked as if I had a singular feminine breast. I sighed again, summoning a small bone spear and stabbing the inflated skin. It hissed as the air left it and reformed in a more masculine manner. That looks good, Hull said. Still need actual clothes, though. It's never enough for you fleshy ones, I complained. First you cover your bones with meat, then you cover the meat with cloth, and sometimes you even cover the cloth with metal. Where does it end? At the armor, Basinoth laughed. I scoffed as I donned my coverings. The cloth was a simple tunic and pants made of various plants suited for the purpose, and the armor was similar in shape to Basinoth's, but made of bone instead of indurated blood. Once I was fully dressed, I made an exaggerated gesture to my outfit. Both of the other kings nodded their approval, and we continued on our trek. Before long, we came upon the clearing of life, and to my surprise, we weren't the first to arrive. Algebron and Tits had managed to find and bring the mortals, and the lot of them were sitting patiently. Yilf was also already seated, casually watching our approach. I detected Tamithi's presence, but they were hiding in some foliage at the edge of a clearing. I gestured at the king of the sprites, and Hull took my meaning and joined them. Basinoth and I made for our seats, but Algebron stopped us with a raised hand. He nodded at the mortals, 2 orcs and the much-discussed human, and they rose. The human looked exactly like the Arch Fay had described him, but slightly more road-worn. Horth, King of the Bone Fay, and Basinoth, King of the Blood Fay, Algebron said, then gestured to the mortals. May I introduce Yulk, Nash, and Nick of Clan Alta? Basinoth and I shared a glance, surprised by the fame of the familial name. Clan Alta, eh? Basinoth asked. I'm fairly certain that I owe one of your ancestors some comeuppance. A member of Clan Alta, an orc about your size and shape, challenged me to a duel about 50 years back. They used a bit of trickery to secure the win, and as their prize they took my I suppressed a laugh as I noticed what had given Basinoth pause. The King of Blood Fay was staring at the belt of the orc known as Nash, upon which rested a serrated battle-axe. I recognized it immediately. My axe? Basinoth finished their sentence. Pray tell, Nash of Clan Alta, How did you come about ownership of Bonebiter? The orc's eyes widened as he instinctively reached for the axe. Instead of drawing it, which would have been a fatal mistake, he ran his hand over it. I bought it from the Adventurers Guild, he explained. My father owned one that was almost just like it. Basinoth and I looked closer at the axe. It was very similar, but contained much more iron than Bonebiter could have. Even though the extra iron makes it a more effective weapon against me, Basinoth would be unable to safely wield it. We exchanged a look. I see, Basinoth laughed. A near-perfect replica. Does your father still have the original? I'll gladly face him again for the chance to regain it. Though he's likely getting on in years, so perhaps we should do a battle of wits instead. My apologies. Nash bowed his head slightly. My father is long dead, and he was buried with the axe. It was his most cherished weapon. I see. You have my condolences. It fills me with a bittersweet happiness to know that he enjoyed my axe so much. Basinoth had it made specifically to give them an edge against me, I explained. Then he immediately lost it to your father. That's true. I retrieved the weapon and ran into your father on my way to challenge Horth. I was unaware that your father had been living wild, as he put it, and agreed to face him for the axe. If I had won, I would have gained his blood. But I fell into one of the traps he had set to catch food for the night. As a result, he took the victory and my axe, Basinoth sighed, and to top it off, the smith that crafted it was hit by a falling star before I could ask them to make another. They were reborn, of course, but lost all memory of how to fashion metals. Divine intervention, I nodded. That's what you get for trying to surpass me. The mortal's eyes widened in horror at our little exchange, except for the sorcerer named Yulk. His eyes remained calm and collected, as if he wasn't the least bit surprised to hear anything that was being said. I found this curious, but before I could ask him anything, Basinoth turned to the human. So, Nick, you must be the one that made a couple of new Arch Fay. Yes, but not on purpose, Nick stammered nervously. How exactly does one make accidentally 2 Arch Fay? I asked, bemused. Well, they stopped us on the road because they wanted our names, but since we need our names, I gave them new names, and then they were Arch Fay. Takes quite a lot of power to create a name for a Fay, Basinoth said. However, that isn't enough to make an Arch Fay. It shouldn't be, at least, I added. Though we're not exactly experts on the matter, Mumaldobran would know more. Just where is the king of the Arch Fay? Having a conniption, Tits said jovially. They'll be joining us shortly. A conniption? What for? A bunch of things, really. First, the fact that we were made Arch Fay under mysterious circumstances. Then, my name and the fact that I chose it. Finally, some of the sprites killed his favorite tea tree as a prank. I instinctively glanced toward Tamithi, who winced and shrank back further into the foliage. Hull was resting upon the sprite's shoulder and had to fight a branch to remain there. Basinoth let out a heavy sigh. I really liked the tea from that tree. Not to worry, Tit said. They were smart enough to save a cutting of the tree, and we've already got it planted. It'll take a few years to grow up, but we'll still be able to enjoy Mumaldobran's special brew at some point in the future. I am pleased to hear that, Mumaldobran said, appearing as if from nowhere. Or rather, my rage is lessened by the news. We did not gather here to discuss my anger, though. Didn't we? Tits asked with a grin. I thought the whole point of this hearing was to discuss how Arch Fay were made without your consent. Isn't that one of the things you're sore about? Mumaldobran stared at Tits, obviously trying to make the Arch Fay's head explode with willpower alone. I found myself becoming a tad impatient at their antics, so I clashed my teeth loudly to snap the king of Arch Fay out of it. It glanced at me with ineffectual annoyance, then cleared its throat. Algebrun, please perform the introductions so that we may get started, Mumaldobran said. We have a lot to discuss. Chapter 54. Master General Kirain Yith, Adventurer level, not applicable, unknown Balushinian. Wait, are you saying you're going to drink my phylactery? The skull asked incredulously. Obviously, I jeered at the defeated lich. The phylactery in question was a completely enclosed glass vial. Without a cork or lid to grant access to its contents, I would have to find a way to break the glass without spilling the precious blood within. Breaking it in such a way that glass got into the blood would also be inconvenient. I spun the vial between my thumb and forefinger as I pondered the problem. "I'd rather you didn't," said the Lich. "Your opinion is as noted as it is irrelevant." "That's not just blood, vampire. It's blood that has been thrice cursed and forcefully imbued with dark magics that have been forgotten to time. There's no telling what will happen to you if you drink it. Best case scenario, you die and I'm stuck in here as a skull until I can find some way to regenerate." "You believe that's the best case scenario?" "Yes, I do. To give an example of the many potential worst-case scenarios, you could become a flesh-eating mutant, doomed to mindlessly wander these halls until an adventurer puts you out of your misery." "Why bother trying to talk me out of drinking this?" I asked. "It isn't as if it's your only phylactery. I can smell another one lurking around here somewhere." "Oh," the talking skull said, "so that's why you haven't killed me." "Yes. Now answer my question." "I care because I do not know what will happen. I have a deep-seated hatred of surprises." "Seems more like a fear." The skull paused, considering its next words. "The two are intrinsically linked. Regardless, this is what I came here to do," I said, as I set the skull down on the throne and licked the end of the vial. "Please, we can probably—" The Lich trailed off as it was drowned out by the shrill whine of my claw scoring the glass. Once I had completed the score, I gently squeezed the vial until I heard cracking noises. I repeated this process until the cracking had ceased. Then I flicked the end of the vial, sending it flying and leaving me with a freshly opened phylactery. "We can find another way to do whatever it is you're trying to do," the Lich pleaded, panic edging into its voice. "You don't have to do this." "Calm down," I replied with a smirk. "Everything will be fine." "No, it won't. You're about to make a terrible—" The skull's semi-ethereal voice seemed to fade away as the overbearing smell of magically enriched blood made its way to my nostrils. The coppery smell that I was more familiar with had always been infatuating to a degree, but this was far more than that. It felt as if it were demanding that I drink it. My fangs involuntarily grew, forcing my mouth open. In the back of my mind, I knew what was happening. The being in my dreams had told me of whispers and their effects. Despite this knowledge, my hand moved toward my mouth of its own volition, and I lacked any desire to stop it. A single drop of the blood touched my tongue, and shockwaves of pure pleasure spread throughout my body. It was like nothing I had ever felt before. Better than the most delicious dessert, better than a gentle massage after a long exercise, better even than making love. I shuddered in ecstasy before draining the phylactery in one gulp. For the briefest of moments, I had found bliss. Every ache and pain was gone, replaced by a kind and loving warmth that embraced every last corner of my body. Then the pleasure turned to an equal and opposite measure of pain. It felt as if all of my muscles and tendons were trying to move in opposite directions, fighting each other in the process. My bones began to crack as if they were breaking, and I heard a scream as I was forced into doubling over. I briefly became aware of the fact that the screaming was coming from my own mouth before I fell to the ground. My head smashed against the smooth tiles, and I was suddenly free from the pain, floating in a void that was rapidly becoming familiar. "Finally," the raspy voice said, "I was beginning to think that you had somehow missed what you needed to do." "What?" I ran out of breath and silently cursed myself for even trying at this point. "What happened?" "You drank the Lich's phylactery, just as you were meant to. Now you will have power." I remember pain. So much pain. Too much pain to survive. I'm jealous. The ability to feel must be so wonderful and horrible. Interesting, to say the least. But why did it hurt so much? Power can only be gained through pain, either your own or someone else's. In this case, your pain was necessary. Your body is reconfiguring itself, which is exactly as pleasant as it sounds. What is it reconfiguring into? Is that a hint of vanity I hear in your voice? It laughed. Are you worried for your physical appearance? No need. You will retain your appearance, though your musculature will be mildly larger than it was before. The reconfiguration mostly impacts your internal organs, and fangs, of course. That doesn't answer my question. It's less fun if I have to give you the answers to everything, the being sighed. Fine, I will spoil the surprise. You are becoming a being that this world has not seen since before the Cataclysm Wars. A master vampire. Its answer left me speechless. It is common knowledge that vampires become more powerful as time passes, growing in strength, speed, magical prowess, and even intelligence. However, this growth is as dramatic as it is mysterious, and does not occur in brood or half-breeds. As such, I had dismissed the knowledge as quickly as I had been forced to learn it. All of it came flooding back, though, as I struggled to cope with what I had just been told. Master vampires are the penultimate form of vampire ascendancy. They are faster, stronger, and capable of much more devastating magical feats than any other vampire. Some vampires spend their entire unlives trying to discover how to become a master. Unfortunately, no vampire wants another vampire to become a master. Masters can use their powers of suggestions on lesser vampires, forcing their intentions upon them as if they were mere fledglings or brood. As a result, all of the research into how to become a master was as jealously guarded as it was fruitless. There's nothing more terrifying to a vampire than to have all of their plans and schemes laid low by a master vampire who has need of them. Of course, these hypnotic powers have limits. I don't know specifically what those limits are, but there were at least 10 masters in the ages before the Cataclysm Wars. 4 of them fell to mortal armies, 2 of them fell to other masters, and the rest fell to betrayal. This includes the founder of the Night Kingdom, who was usurped. A master vampire, I finally asked. And what am I to do with this gift? Your only obligation to me is to do what comes natural to you. It will take you some time to get used to your new body, though, and bear in mind that consuming blood is no longer optional. You need less of it than a standard vampire does, but you will perish if you do not feed. I don't suppose you can tell me where I can find blood? It is within my capabilities, yes. There is a town relatively nearby, to the southeast of the entrance to the dungeon. There is a hidden tunnel that leads to an abandoned manor within the town. The locals believe this manor is haunted, and most avoid it if they can. Won't a drow stand out in a dwarven town? The town is racially mixed, but yes, a drow will stand out. That won't be a problem. Why not? I cannot say. I'm already towing the line regarding what I can tell you. I understand. I'll find the hidden tunnel. Can you tell me more about my abilities? Not in detail. Suffice it to say that you're in for a surprise after your first meal. The entity began to laugh, and before I could ask it to clarify, my eyes snapped open. I took in a breath and noticed smells that I hadn't noticed before. Even the smells that I had noticed before smelled more defined and pungent. My ears were ringing, and I tried to put my hand to my forehead to soothe the ache behind my eyes. Instinctively, my head tilted to the right as my right hand sailed past it and smashed into the floor, cracking the stone tiles. I stared at the broken tiles in shock for a few moments before I realized the ringing in my ears had turned to buzzing. Buzzing that sounded suspiciously like someone attempting to communicate with me. I closed my eyes, shook my head, and swallowed to clear my ears of pressure. "Do you still have your wits about you, vampire?" asked the Lich. "Or have you been driven to madness by the potency of my blood?" "Do not worry for me, Lich. I am cognizant of my surroundings," I said with a grin that demonstrated my new fangs. "Gods, your fangs! What in the hell's happened to you?" I licked my teeth, inadvertently shredding my tongue in the process. I quickly closed my mouth to hide this blunder. I pretended to clear my throat as I waited for my tongue to heal enough to reply. For centuries, perhaps millennia, vampires have been wishing to do what I've just done. Yet, for all their studies and efforts, a half-breed has accomplished it first, I said with a laugh. I have ascended. Ascended? What do you... The Lich trailed off for a moment. Oh, I see. You're a master vampire now. Correct. And now I must seek a source of nutrition. Where is the secret tunnel to the city nearby? I'm not helping you until you kill me. I stared into the eyeless skull and felt it staring back at me. We continued this contest of gazes in silence for a few moments before I sighed and shrugged. So be it, I'll find it myself, I said, rising from the ground to study the walls. You're going to leave me here then? What better place for you than your throne? This isn't my throne. Then whose? I trailed off as I found a disguised switch. No, it doesn't matter. I have more important matters to attend to. I pressed the switch, and a door hidden within the wall silently slid open. I looked back toward the Lich with a cruel grin. Farewell, Lich. Fret not, I'll return soon. I hope not. I laughed and entered the hidden passage. I found another switch inside, which closed the hidden door behind me. This passage led to another room, filled with odds and ends that indicated that it was a mixture of an apothecary and library, both of which had seen extensive use fairly recently. I explored this area, finding several rooms in various states of disrepair. I found a kitchen, a room with several destroyed beds, an armory full of rusty equipment, empty jail cells, a dining hall with rotted furniture, a surgical suite, and an abandoned altar to a long-forgotten malignant entity. Finally, I came across the tunnel that my own malignant entity had spoken of. As I traveled this tunnel, I realized that it opened up many possibilities for me. Instead of leaving the corpses where they lay, I could bring them back with me and create my own vampire horde. I could even purchase the manor at the end of this passage, becoming a well-respected member of the town. Before long, I could take control of the town and raise an actual army. With this army, I could attack the Night Kingdom with no need of plots or secrecy. Then the vampires that managed to survive King Lofin's purge would be forced to bow to my will. I would be able to expand our borders, using the drow as fodder for brood. It was with these pleasant thoughts in mind that I came to the end of the tunnel. I found another switch, opening another secret door and allowing me access to the manor. It was decrepit. I had entered into the foyer, and great marble columns covered in mold and moss greeted me. The two larger columns held the ceiling, and four smaller ones held up the staircase, the center of which had collapsed. The giant windows surrounding the doors had all been broken and boarded up. The tile flooring was partly covered by a rug that must have cost a lifetime's worth of earnings, but was now as worthless as the detritus covering it. Even through all the wear and tear of time, I could see how splendid this place had once been. I found myself a little jealous, for my own manor could hardly compare. I wondered what had caused this town's populace to find it so loathsome. But my theorizing was interrupted by a very welcome scent. Prey, I quickly and quietly tracked the scent and found someone sleeping in what had been the dining room. An obviously homeless elf was resting on a table which had lost its legs. The smell of his day-to-day life was repugnant, but thankfully it was overwhelmed by the scent of his lifeblood. Happy to find my first meal, and potentially my first lackey, I bit into him with such speed that he didn't even have time to wake before his blood was gushing into my waiting maw. I greedily gulped it down in record time, feeling the warmth flood through me. Even after his heart stopped, I drank until there was no blood remaining. I dropped the elf and instinctively felt a change occur within me. My current physical form malleable. It can change, bend, morph into something else. Someone else, even. I can grow taller or shorter, fatter or thinner, darker or lighter. While the process of changing is magical, the change itself is physical in nature and cannot be detected via magical means. Shapeshifting, a skill that many of the fair folk use to wreak mischief and mayhem among mortals. The knowledge of this ability and its endless possibilities swarmed my mind, even as my newest victim looked up at me. His newly acquired fangs were on full show within a childish grin. I stood, and he moved into a kneeling position, still looking up at me with the same expression. "Are you ready to serve me?" I asked. "Yes, Master." Chapter 55. Nick Smith. Adventurer level 7. Human, American. Algebron went around introducing everyone. Basinoth, king of Blood Fay, wore the same armor as the Blood Fay that Algebron had summoned earlier, but was much taller and had a meaner-looking face. His chiseled jaw and low-set brow made it look as if he was permanently scowling. Horth, king of Bone Fay, had nearly identical facial features, but both his skin and armor were an off-putting pale yellow-white color. It took a second for me to realize that it was the same color as sun-bleached bone, which makes sense since he's the king of Bone Fay, I guess. Mamuldobrand didn't look like I had expected at all. His chin was rounded and his brow was high, giving him an almost childlike face. The pudgy cheeks and belly enhanced this effect, but his eyes were as serious as a heart attack. He stood shorter than most of the Fae, only surpassing Tit's height by an inch or two, but he somehow exuded a commanding presence. I wondered how Algebran and Tits were able to muster up the courage to piss him off. Mumaldobran and Algebran were wearing the same outfit, pants and shirts that looked as if they were made of leaves, with intricate stitching that formed odd patterns that kind of hurt to look at. Tit's outfit was similar, but her shirt was cut low enough that I realized she didn't have a navel. I also noticed that the patterns on her clothing forced my eyes toward her substantial cleavage. I sighed internally as I endeavored to look away from her as much as possible. Ylf, king of the flower fairies, looked exactly as I imagined a flower fairy would look. He stood at about 8 inches tall, and his facial features were soft and kind. His most striking attribute was his wings, which were every color that I could think of in a pattern that reminded me of my mum's flower garden. He was wearing what could only be described as a onesie made of flowers, and when Algebran introduced him, he held out a hand to me. "What are you doing?" Horth asked. "Mortals like to touch things, and one of their favored greetings is a handshake," Ylf explained. I gently took his hand and was shocked by how cold it was. Then I was surprised by strength of his grip and shake. We shook for nearly 40 seconds before Algebran interceded. "I'm fairly certain that's too long of a handshake, Ylf," he said. "Really?" Ylf asked. "It's a very pleasant sensation, though. Such a warm hand, with a nice and firm grip as well. I could shake it all day." "We do have other matters to attend to," Mumaldobran sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Oh yes, my apologies." Ylf released my hand and smiled at me. I nervously returned his smile, and then realized that I had been internally referring to these creatures as male and female. With Tits and the other Fae, it was an easy mistake to make. They were practically caricatures of their displayed genders. Ylf, though, was much more androgynous, and this had made me realize my mistake. A few of my friends back home struggled to define themselves with gender, and would probably do much better than I can in this situation. Some of my other friends would do much worse, though. Before I could start wondering how all of them were doing, I refocused on the situation at hand and endeavored to avoid referring to the fair folk using gendered pronouns at all cost. "Now that we are acquainted, let's get started," Mumaldobran said, gesturing to the chairs and tables. The seating rearranged to form a semicircle facing 5 seats with matching tables. Algebran looked at me and gestured to the center seat. I sat, and Yulk took the seat to my left. Algebran sat next to Yulk, and both Tits and Nash tried to sit to my immediate right. "No," Tits winked at him and pointed to the other chair. "You sit there, I'll sit here." "But," Nash said, trailing off and looking to Algebran for help. "Honestly," Algebran shook his head, "Nash, you should let them take that spot. We should just be grateful that they're sitting in a chair, and not on Nick's lap." "Now there's an idea," Tits said with a wide smile. "No," I stated emphatically. "Oh, come on, Nick, don't be like that. Uncross your arms and lean back so I can—" Mumaldobran slammed a fist on the table in front of him. "Sit in the thrice-damned chair. Now." Tits shot the king of the Arch Fay a venomous glare, but did as she was told. The 2 Arch Fay held eyes for a few moments before Mumaldobran turned his attention to me. "Now then," Mumaldobran said, "Nicodemus Liam Smith, I understand that you provided a name to both Algebran and Tits, and immediately afterward they were transformed into Arch Fay. I also understand that you are attached. Please elaborate on your interaction with the being you spoke with in the void." "Mumaldobran, I feel that's unnecessary," Algebran interrupted. "I've already told you all about that interaction." Yes, Algebran. You saw his memories when your blood mingled. However, when viewing memories in such a way, the view is crystal clear, a perfected recollection, if you will. One's perceptions of one's memories are often different from the memories themselves, though. Nearly always, in fact. The higher ones are far trickier than even we, and it would be a simple matter for them to alter one's perception to grant different information than what actually occurred. "Huh?" Horth and Basinoth asked simultaneously, then shared an angry glance with one another. Mumaldobran sighed. To put it simply, with a little help from the higher one, Nick may have gleaned something from the memory that Algebran wouldn't have been able to. All eyes turned to me, and my mouth went dry. What if what I tell them is wrong? What if they aren't able to get the answers they need? I can practically feel how powerful they are. What will I do if they get mad at what I say? We were attacked by bandits, and I cast healing on a friend of ours who was injured. I ended up using all of my magic and lost consciousness, I explained. It was dark, then it was bright, and I was suddenly naked. Then there was Cass, except she wasn't really Cass. Irrelevant details, Mumbled interrupted. What did the higher one say to you? I assume it told you to do something. Yes, it told me that I was about to go down the wrong path, and I needed to see King Isekai because some stupid mer were about to do some stupid things. It also told me not to tell anyone. Great, now that you've chastised him about irrelevant details, he left out some of the relevant ones, Yilf said, sticking its tongue out at Mumbled. Nick, we'd like your interpretation of these events as they happened. Start from when you met the higher one. Okay, we were both nude, and I thought she was in disguise. But she, or it, I guess. It said that my brain was trying to make sense of where we were and that it was interesting that I saw it as my girlfriend, I explained. It told me that my brothers and I wouldn't know what to do when we got to Bolisir, and that we needed to see King Isekai, or it would take years for me to figure out how to get home because some stupid mer were about to do some stupid things. It also called Yulk cute. Not an inaccurate description, Yulf laughed. Go on. It said that it's rooting for me, and that the reason it didn't tell me exactly what I should do to get home is because of a pact. Then its appearance changed, and I could see bright red chains binding it. I asked it if I should tell anyone about it, and it said no, because it would lead to violence and bloodshed. I asked why it was approaching me, and it explained that it really wanted to and threatened to throw a temper tantrum if it wasn't picked. Then it told me to train, and I woke up. Yeah, that sounds like a higher one to me, Horth said bitterly. The details that the human remembers tell a story, Mumbled said. Nick saw the higher being as someone close to it, which… Him, Yeath interrupted. Nick is a male. Oh, I really don't give a shit, Mumbled snarled. When it comes to speaking, one should do it right or not at all, Arch Fay King, Basinoth said. Fine, he saw the higher being as someone close to him. Happy? There you go, Yeath grinned. Good job, keep it up. Mumbled muttered something that sounded obscene before recomposing himself. Nick saw the higher being as someone close to him, he continued with an annoyed glance at Yeath, which could indicate that the higher being is close to him. It could be acting as a protector or guide, the latter of which is somewhat more likely given the rest of their interaction. This higher being set Nick on a path that would lead to the awakening of the High Dragon, King of Elves, who happens to be one of our oldest allies. Then the higher one told him that telling anyone would lead to bloodshed. Once Mumbled said bloodshed, all of the gathered fair folks' expressions dampened. Even Tits, who had been staring at the side of my face, turned to look at the king of Arch Fay. You don't think? Basinoth trailed off. I do think. Frequently, in fact. It's fun, you should try it. Mumbled grinned. Fuck you. Maybe later. What's more concerning is that Nick clearly recalls the higher one saying that some stupid mer will do some stupid things, and indicating that he needed to see King Isekai because of this. This was Nick's knee-jerk recollection when I pressured him earlier. I'm starting to dislike where this analysis is going, Horth said. It gets worse. We know now that this higher one enjoys interacting with our world, and is currently under a pact, likely one of limited interaction, which means that a highest one is involved. Maybe even the highest one. May I ask some questions? I interrupted. Mumbled gave me the same annoyed look that it gave Yith earlier, but nodded. What is a highest one, and why is bloodshed relevant? Beings that are far more powerful than the higher ones and had a hand in the creation of the universe, Algebran explained. They do not interact with anything except for the higher ones, and mortals rarely even come to the realization that they exist. Mortals call the higher ones gods, but the highest ones are better described as such. And the reason that bloodshed is relevant is because fair folk don't bleed, Mumbled added. The higher one you spoke to would have known of this hearing. It would have known that your options would be to tell us the truth, or try to avoid telling us anything, and subtly informed you of the consequences of either choice. We also have a vague warning of stupid Mer doing stupid things. A previously incapacitated ally suddenly awakened by the same one bearing this warning. 2 mysteriously created Arch Fay and a higher one under a pact of limited interaction. Which means that all of the higher ones are likely under a similar pact. Yeath said with a slight frown, I think we now know where Algebran and Tits came from. One of the higher ones promoted them, but couldn't tell us that they did so. More importantly, we're going to be attacked soon, Horth grinned, and it must be a serious attack if it wouldn't lead to bloodshed with us left unwarned. We get to add to our collections, Basinoth returned Horth's grin. Nick, Nash, Yulk, we are done here, and you may continue upon your journey, Mummeldobran said while he rose from his seat. Oh, and thank you for your time. You now have permission to wander these lands with up to 3 companions each, unmolested by the Arch Fay and the Fay they oversee. And the Blood Fay, Basinoth added. And the Bone Fay, Horth nodded. I can make no promises regarding any of the fairies. Yeath shrugged and smiled. Thankfully, we're mostly a friendly sort. Wait, can't we help in some way? I asked. You already have, Algebran said. You have made a choice that has allowed us to prepare for the upcoming attack. Algebran's correct, Mummeldobran interjected. Plus, you have things to do, and we don't know when this attack is going to occur. It could be days from now or years from now. Such is the nature of the higher ones. Nash and Yulk rose from their seats, and I followed suit. Yulk put his hand on my shoulder and gave it a small squeeze. I looked up at him, and he gave me a small smile. Let's go, Nick, he said. Don't worry, they'll be okay without us. Yeah, the King of Blood Fay fought our dad and didn't die, Nash grinned. They're plenty strong. I let out a small sigh, unable to shake the worry that something bad might happen to Algebran and Tits. Then I looked around at the assembled fairfolk and realized that a fight alongside them would probably be out of my league anyway. I nodded slowly. Yeah, I said, you're pro— I want to go with Nick, Tits interrupted. He could likely use my help on his journey, and my aid would be more beneficial to him than it would be to the deep wild forest. Plus, I haven't seduced him yet. The clearing went silent as everyone turned to look at Tits in disbelief. A few seconds passed before Mummeldobran cleared its throat. You have no idea how much I'd like to say yes to that request and be free of your annoyance for a time, the King of Arch Fay said. However, I am getting a very powerful urge to say no and cannot pinpoint the source of said urge. A whisper, Tits said sadly. I see. Well, sorry, Nick. Looks like I'm needed here and can't go with you after all. Huh? I managed to reply. Go now, lovely little object of my adoration, she whispered, stepping closer and putting her finger against my lips. Before I change my mind. The warmth of her finger barely registered in my mind as I stared deeply into her eyes and saw how serious she was. We stood there for a moment while I thought about what to do. A smile began to creep over her face. I could almost see her mind changing, which made up my mind about what to do. I turned and ran back the way we came as fast as I could. Chapter 56. Nash Altar, Adventurer Level 9, Orc Nulavan. Yulk and I watched in alarmed disbelief as Nick sprinted off into the forest. His sudden departure left me in a bind. I couldn't go after him because that would involve leaving Yulk behind, who would not be able to keep pace with us due to his back. My concern for Nick waned a bit when I remembered what the fairfolk had said regarding our ability to travel their territory, though. They won't mess with him, and he's strong enough to be able to hold his own against most of the monsters and animals around these parts. He's apparently fast enough to outrun the ones he can't too. Though whether or not he's smart enough to make that decision is another matter entirely. I shrugged and turned back to Tits and Algebran. Well, I guess it's time for us to get going, I said. Indeed it is. Algebran smiled warmly. See you later. Later. Yulk and I waved as we left the clearing, following Nick's hastily made path. We had to watch our step because of the undergrowth that littered the ground. How the boy managed to sprint through this without breaking his neck is a wonder. Despite the distractions of the undergrowth and my desire to yell at Nick, I found my mind wandering back to what Algebran had said. It wasn't an uncommon way to say goodbye, but it struck me as odd that it came from a Fay. Was it truly a farewell, or was it intended to be a premonition? "Hey, Yulk, what do you suppose Algebran meant?" I asked. "When it said, 'see you later,' I mean." "I very much doubt it was utilizing the colloquialism," Yulk chuckled. "The real question is, when will it see us later and under what circumstances?" "That's two questions," I said. "No, it isn't." "Yeah, it is." No, by adding the "and," I chained the thoughts together to form one coherent question. If I were able to write it down, you would see. "Trying to use your advantage of being able to read, eh?" I said, unable to hide my grin. "That's how I know I'm right." "Oh, I see. You're playing the fool." Yulk returned my grin. "You know, it's quite the convincing act. So convincing, in fact, that I'm not entirely convinced that it is an act." I laughed at the insult, and we continued walking through the forest. Eventually, the trees and undergrowth thinned out, making things much easier on Yulk. "Come to think of it, Algebran didn't specify that we would see each other," I said. "That's true," he replied. "Perhaps they were hinting at a plan to keep us under surveillance." "Could be," I nodded as we left the woods and began following the road. "Tits all but confirmed your theory that they aren't bound to the forest. Indeed, it's unlikely that she would mistakenly believe she could accompany Nick on our journey. Regardless, I doubt we have anything to fear from Arch Fay surveillance." "I guess you're right. Oh look," I pointed to the cart, "Algebran's spell is gone." Imlaw, Olmira and Nick were chatting as they waited for us. The conversation grew silent as we approached, and Nick's eyes glued themselves to the ground. He rubbed the back of his neck and cleared his throat. He began. "Don't you fucking me," I angrily interrupted. "The hell did you run off for? It's not like we could keep up, what with Yulk's back. Were you so embarrassed by the attention of tits that you lost your reason?" "That's a hell of a sentence," Imlaw chuckled. My glare shifted to the gnome, and he lifted his hands in apology. I turned my attention back to Nick, who was still staring at the dirt, as if it were going to do a trick. "Look, I was scared," he explained. "Cass means everything to me, and I haven't had anyone else show interest so aggressively." I opened my mouth to chastise him further, but Yulk snorted. "That's just cute," he said quietly. "Cute?" I asked, less quietly. "Nash, relax. I'm the injured party here, and you're much angrier than I am. While I appreciate your concern, you would do well to remember that he's not that far removed from childhood. We don't just abandon each other, brother. Even children know that. It isn't as if we were left surrounded by monsters or... That's debatable. The fair folk don't see things the same way that we do. Acts we see as monstrous, they see as mundane entertainment. Regardless, we were and are safe, and Nick has not demonstrated the kind of personality that would have left us if we hadn't been," Yulk said sternly, clapping his hands to indicate the conversation was over. "Now, let's get going. We've got a lot of ground to cover." I gave Nick one last glare, and we all loaded back into the cart and continued our journey. Things were tense at first, but eventually the atmosphere eased up. We settled into a pattern of sleeping, eating, driving, training, eating, driving, and sleeping. For the first day or two, I took out my anger with Nick in our training sessions. Once my anger was abated, I eased up on the boy, allowing me to notice that he had actually made a lot of progress. On the fourth day, his training sword managed to find my neck, and he expertly held it there without harming me. "Good," I said, pushing the sword away. "Your footwork is a little sloppy, but you're finally starting to understand the basics of swordsmanship." "Awesome," Nick replied, collapsing to the ground and panting. "What comes after the basics?" "Expert drills, which are much more difficult and dangerous. There are many different ways to wield a sword, and each sword and wielder has their own strengths and weaknesses within each form," I explained while gathering up his sword. "The wielder must be made aware of these strengths and weaknesses and memorize them. I'll be able to take you through the first few drills, but then we'll have to find a swordmaster." "Really? Why?" "Because expert drills are done with real swords, and I am a generalist in the art of bladed weaponry." If I try to lead you through specialist training, it's likely to end in injury. The bad kind of injury. I can heal us, he said with a grin. Not without your head, I said without expression. One slash in the wrong direction, and it's all over. Nick's grin faded as the realization of how dangerous this training could be dawned on him. Before I could hammer the point further, the sound of hoofbeats caught my ears. Nick heard them too, and we both walked to the road to see who was coming. 2 harnesses carrying orcs wearing the messenger uniforms of Kina rode toward us. Both harnesses also carried large sacks, which were no doubt full to the brim with mail. I waved a greeting, and to my surprise they stopped to speak with us. "Ho there," one of the messengers greeted us. "Are you the ones that High Chief Ulamak sent to Bolisir?" "Of course they are," the other said, pointing to Nick. "That's the human." "We are indeed. What business have we?" I asked. "I'm Frilk. This is Poma," the first orc said. "You wouldn't happen to be trailed by an army, would you?" "No, they left before we did." "Damn it," Poma said. "The High Chief was hoping we'd be able to intercept them." "Why's that?" "The invasion has been thwarted. Their reinforcement is no longer necessary." "Really? Already?" "Oh yes," Frilk said with a grin. "And it's quite the tale too. Get this. Our boys tamed a Nahalim and used it to break through the Drow's defenses." My eyes widened, and I let out a low whistle. "That's not all," Poma added. "Turns out the leader of the invasion force was a half-vampire drow. The sick fuck was using his own sister as a blood bank." "Well, that's going to be a black eye for Lofin," Yulk said as he approached. "Damn right, and the bastard deserves it too," Frilk spit. "So there's no point in us carrying on in this direction because the elven army isn't behind you, right?" "Correct. I would assume that they took the adventurer path," Yulk said. "But that path is impassable. Landslide, yes? Yes. Then they'll likely be able to clear the obstacle using their army." Yulk smiled. "The United Chiefdoms probably won't even have to foot the bill. High Chief Ulamak will be pleased with that, at least. I doubt the Elven General will be, though, much less the Regent." "Oh, we don't have to worry about the Regent anymore." "What do you mean?" "King Isinirath, the High Dragon, has awakened." Yulk's smile turned into a grin. "He's retaken his place as ruler of Bolisir." The 2 messengers sat upon their harnesses with mouths agape. Their flummoxed expressions were well-founded. This news would have interesting effects throughout the chiefdoms, maybe even the entire continent. "Well, I think High Chief Ulamak would want to hear about that," Frilk said. "You want to go tell him, or should I?" "Why not both of us?" Poma asked. "One of us has to backtrack down the adventurer path and intercept Bolisir's army. Damn, it would be nice to get off the road for a bit, but I don't have any idea how the High Chief's gonna react to the news about the dragon." Poma rubbed his chin. "I'll find the army. You go tell the High Chief." "Sounds like a plan," Frilk said, turning back to us. "All right, we're off. Have a good journey." "You too," I nodded. The pair of messengers turned their harnesses around and began traveling back the way they came. "You know, it didn't actually occur to me that High Chief Ulamak might be angry that King Isinirath has awakened," Yulk said. "When we report, do you think we should leave out how he was awakened?" Nick asked. "No," I answered. "The High Chief may be angry with you, but you're a member of the Alta family. You'll be safe from his wrath. Plus, he'd be even angrier if he were to find out we omitted the truth." "Indeed, best to get it over and done with as soon as we can," Yulk nodded. "We should tell him about the entity that visited your dreams as well. He might have some information to share with us." "Really? How?" Nick asked. "He's royalty, a legitimate member of the Orcish royal line, one of the few remaining royal families. That doesn't just come with power, it comes with knowledge and secrets. It's entirely possible that he doesn't know anything about gods or higher beings, but it shouldn't hurt to ask. But what if he's one of the Mer about to do a stupid thing?" "Did he strike you as particularly stupid?" I asked. "No." Nick paused. "But you don't have to be stupid to do stupid things." "True, but the higher one in your dream said stupid Mer doing stupid things. Since Ulamak isn't a stupid Mer, I don't think we have to worry." "Yeah, but We have plenty of time to think about this, Yulk interrupted. We should get back on the road. After a moment of hesitation, Nick and I nodded our agreement, and the three of us packed our stuff back onto the cart. Olmira and Imlaw were already waiting for us, and once we loaded up, we started moving again. Olmira had been uncomfortably quiet since our encounter with the Fae, and I decided to try to ease this discomfort by breaking the silence. So, I began, Olmira, you're not actually Olmira? Or, like, how does that work? That's the most awkward question I've ever heard, she laughed. Yes and no. I have all of the memories of Olmira and all of the memories of the Fae that I was before becoming an undead. Well, maybe not all of them. It's been a long time and I've forgotten a lot. So you're like two people merged into one? Nick asked. Kind of. It is somewhat difficult to explain. Technically, I am no longer Olmira, but I think like Olmira and feel like Olmira. It kind of feels like the Fae memories were just something I picked up along the way. Why didn't you tell me of this? Yulk asked with a carefully neutral tone. I am sorry, Yulk. It never really came up, and let's face it, your ideas about vampires and the undead were much more logical than the truth of the matter. Plus, I wasn't entirely convinced the memories were real in the first place. I do remember a situation exactly as the Fae described while I was being turned, but it was as if it were buried within my subconscious. I genuinely don't believe I would have been able to properly eloquate the thought before our encounter with the Fairfolk. Olmira said, then sighed. Those are just excuses, though. Truthfully, I was afraid of what you might think. What do you mean? Well, you might have conflated me with the Fae that I apparently used to be, and seen me as a monster. Or worse, you may have had questions that I had no answer to and believed me to be a fool. Either way, it would have been difficult to maintain our relationship as student and teacher. Nick, Imlaw, and I sat uncomfortably as the air thickened with awkward emotion. Every second that Yulk spent formulating his response felt like an eternity. You have mistaken me, Yulk said softly. I do not judge others on the actions they took eras ago, nor do I conflate ignorance with foolishness. It would be a lie to say that I wouldn't have seen you in a different light, but I would have proudly continued to benefit from your instruction. I see. It would appear that my reasons for the secret were more wounding than the secret itself. Once again, I apologize. It's forgiven, he smiled. I don't expect you. What? I said it's forgiven. There's no point in dwelling over it, especially since you're remorseful. Friends keep secrets from each other all the time, and this is likely one of the least harmful of those secrets. I probably have a secret or two as well, though none come to mind. So, what? That's it? Olmira asked incredulously. You don't see me any differently. Of course I do, Yulk laughed. Apparently you're much more knowledgeable than I had previously believed, which means you still have much more to teach me. It never even occurred to me that you may be a fount of information regarding the Fae. Obviously, I'd quite like to maintain our relationship as student and teacher, as well as our friendship. Oh, of course. The air cleared as the pair smiled at each other, and we continued our journey to Kina. Chapter 57. High Chief Ulamak, Adventurer level, not applicable. Orc, Kirkenian. I signaled for Razun to leave as the two dwarves settled into their seats. Liath was working very hard to avoid making eye contact with me. The dwarf he accompanied did not have any such issues, and was actively trying to stare me down. Really? I sighed. I appreciate your support, Emperor, but what possessed you to personally accompany your forces? Emperor Jack crossed his arms angrily and raised an eyebrow. As if you don't know, he replied curtly. While I understand that you vehemently support us against the Night Kingdom, you could have simply sent a general in your stead. Lofin and the thugs he calls soldiers are of little concern to me. I am here about the damn mine. I stared at Jack with a neutral expression, my brain trying to process the levels of pettiness I was currently witnessing. I turned my gaze to Liath for an explanation, but he was busy shrinking in his seat. An easy feat for a dwarf, but he was trying to make it look difficult. You came all this way, braving the perils and discomforts of the roads, for a thrice-damned mine? I asked, trying my best not to shout. You're damn right I did, Jack exclaimed, trying less hard than I to keep his voice down. I sent messenger after messenger, missive after missive, and all I got back were rejections with empty platitudes. Or worse, silence. Finally, I spend an entire day dictating a missive, and I get your response back in the form of a fucking spy with a note. Lyeth somehow shrank further in response to Emperor Jack's rage, but I had to struggle not to smile. The anger that he was currently feeling had been precisely my intention. However, it had not occurred to me that he would travel such a distance to express said anger. A small part of me was actually impressed. My attention was required elsewhere, I explained. What with the war and all. So naturally you sent an information broker with a scrap of paper with a few scribbles on it, Jack snorted. Diplomacy seems to have changed a bit since my youth. I sent my good friend Lyeth, who happens to be quite diplomatic, to verbally plead my case for a compromise regarding the mine. Lyeth perked up a bit when he heard me call him a friend, but Jack's eyes narrowed dangerously. Before he could speak, I accusingly pointed a finger at him. "Did you even let him tell you about the compromise?" I asked angrily. Oh, of course not," Jack said defensively. "The note said enough. You want to hire some of my people as trainers for your own miners and maintain complete possession of the mine. What could he have possibly added to that?" He could have explained the benefits. He could have granted you some perspective on the issue. He could have explained why I'm unwilling to entertain the idea of allowing your miners into my country to plunder my resources, while you give me the scraps. The land that mine is on used to be ours. I think my offer is preferable to the alternative of taking it back. "Trying to take it back, you mean?" I snarled, "and that is a very selective recollection of the history of that land. How did it come into the possession of your empire?" "It was fairly conquered by Emperor Rofnik," Jack sneered. "Emperor Rofnik launched a sneak attack against us and proceeded to slaughter everyone living there. The very opposite of fair, in fact. However, he also only held the land for 8 years before we routed his invasion and executed him, ending his bloodline and allowing yours to take control of the empire. So yes, the land was conquered from us, but we conquered it right back. What right do you claim to this land that isn't immediately cancelled out by the very same logic you're using to claim the right?" Emperor Jack grew silent and contemplative. Absolute power leads to being surrounded by those who feel compelled to feed into one's delusions. Having those delusions ripped to shreds by someone of equal standing can be a shock. To his credit, Jack took it well. "Fine, tell me more of this compromise of yours," he said. Before I could say anything, there was a knock on the door. Rezun poked his head in and held up a piece of paper. I raised an eyebrow and beckoned him to enter. "Apologies for the interruption, Your Majesties, but it's urgent," Rezun said as he handed me the paper. I dismissed Rezun and wasted no time reading the paper, then sighed as Jack and Lyeth leaned forward. My scouts had failed to intercept the Elven army, and on top of that, "I will gladly tell you of my proposed compromise, but it would appear that there are things we must discuss that are a tad more urgent," I said. "First, I'm sorry you and your army marched all this way, but the Drow have already been defeated." "What?" Jack asked. "How? We deployed mounted mages, and in response, the Drow fortified the position they took up in one of our villages. Apparently some of our soldiers captured and tamed an Ahalim, then proceeded to use it to overrun the position." I see. Indeed. Unfortunately, I was right about the Drow general being a vampire. His sister, whom he was using for sustenance, confirmed that he's a half-breed. He escaped during the battle, heading west. Into my territory? Perhaps, but he could have just as easily turned north and returned home once he lost his pursuers. I've sent word to King Lofin with what we've learned. It reeks of conspiracy, and while I'd love to see King Lofin flayed alive, having the Night Kingdom seized by vampires would be very undesirable. "Yes, it would," Jack said, and then chuckled. "This means my army was essentially an honor guard escorting me to our debate about the mine. Largest honor guard ever, methinks. Speaking of which..." "Wait. You said first." "Indeed I did. You see, I also sent for aid from Bolisir. Once I learned of our victory, I sent messengers to you and the elves to inform you of the circumstances. The messenger I sent your way missed you, but should be reporting to your general right about now." I chuckled. "The messenger I sent to Bolisir missed their army, but ran into the messengers I had sent to request aid, who had some rather interesting information for me. King Isinirath has awakened. Lyath's eyes went wide, and I expected a similar expression from Emperor Jack. Instead, I was met with confusion. "Who is King Isinirath?" Jack asked. "What?" I asked incredulously. "I've never heard of Isinirath. What is he king of? Why should we be concerned that he's awakened?" King Isinirath is the high dragon that's been sleeping in Bolisir. He's the king of Bolisir. Then who the fuck is Oakmore? A regent. Oh, I see. I suppose that's why he never called himself king in our correspondence. I had assumed he was being haughty and considered himself above titles. Did he not identify himself as Regent Oakmore? He did, yes, but for some reason I thought that was his name. Regardless, how does this dragon's awakening impact things? I've never met King Isinirath and do not know his temperament. High dragons are meant to be fair and just rulers, but legends are prone to exaggeration, so I don't know. Then it's entirely possible that Bolisir just became a hostile nation. Yes, it is a possibility, I shrugged. I have faith in Oakmore, though. Oakmore likes you a whole lot more than he likes me. Nah! If you knew him well enough, you would know that's irrelevant. He's honorable, almost to a fault, and cares enough about his people to avoid pointless conflict. You'll forgive me if I don't wholeheartedly believe you. I will continue to be wary of things to come until my fears are assuaged. The stakes involved are too high for me to take things on blind faith, Jack said solemnly. However, hearing you say that does ease my mind a bit. And speaking of pointless conflict— Oh, right. The fucking mine, I groaned. My compromise is simple. We are speaking of my land and my resources, and I don't need your miners to get at them. However, I am willing to allow some of your more experienced miners to supervise the operation and provide training and feedback where needed in exchange for a smaller percentage of the take than you suggested. How much smaller? 90 to me, 10 to you, split by the gram after smelting. We might as well just fuck off then. No, 25. A quarter of the take for supervising? Pull the other one. Supervising and training, Jack crossed his arms. Fine, 20. Jack and I locked eyes and stared each other down as Leath shifted uncomfortably. 20's still too much for such a limited role in the operations. It could be that he knows that and thinks that I don't. Or, why are you asking for so much of the take? I finally asked. I assume you have a reason other than trying to piss me off. Of course I fucking do. Jack sighed and shook his head. Listen, what I'm about to tell you is a state secret. Word of this can't leave this office. You have my word. Mine too, for what it's worth, Leath said. Jack twitched a bit, seemingly having forgot that Leath was in the room. He stared at Leath for a moment, then nodded slowly. We're on the cusp of a coin shortage, Jack said. How? I asked, alarmed. There's a lot of factors at play. Too many precious metals are tied up in constructions, we have a skyrocketing population, and there's people hoarding liquid assets. I've banned the use of gold and silver in construction, but my advisors feel that it's likely too late to stop what's coming. What are the consequences of a coin shortage? Leath asked. Won't people just be able to barter if they don't have coins? Sure, but how do you tax that? Jack scoffed. Without sales tax, how do we maintain infrastructure and a military? The tax as it stands is simple and easy for people to understand, which makes them more likely to comply. The proposed barter taxes make even my head spin. If people don't understand how to calculate the tax, how are they going to pay it? And how are they going to pay it without coin? Am I supposed to accept a quarter of a clucker? Plus the issue of foreign currency, I added. If a coin shortage occurs, people who can't barter will likely use foreign coins to pay their debts, which may drive down the value of Calcutti's currency, especially if those coins contain a higher concentration of precious metals, which will only serve to exacerbate the issue by causing inflation. So why not just tear down the buildings made of gold? Leath asked. Well, for the most part, that gold is privately owned. And if I start tearing down government buildings to get at the gold in them, it's going to cause concerns among the populace. These concerns could result in bank runs and other financial and fiscal issues that we'd all like to avoid if possible. I leaned back in my chair and considered Emperor Jack's position carefully. On the one hand, these economic issues could spread beyond the Empire's borders and into my own lands. On the other hand, I now have some forewarning, which could allow me to take advantage of this situation and come out on top. But that wouldn't exactly be the neighborly thing to do. Fine, we can do 25%, I said, but I want this remembered. It will be. The Empire of Calcuti will happily owe the unified chiefdoms a favor. Have your people draft an agreement and I'll sign it, Jack said, standing. Now, time to return home since there's nothing left to do here, apparently. A shame, I was looking forward to a fight. Don't be so hasty, friend, I said with a grin. You may want to stay a bit longer. Why's that? Because the messengers I sent to Bolisir are very interesting. So interesting that you'll want to meet them. My grin grew, and they'll be back soon. Chapter 58. Chapter 58. Yulk Alta Adventurer Level 7 Orc Nullivan. The city guards finished his inspection and waved us through to Kina. Well, calling it an inspection is a bit of an overstatement. They simply glanced at our cargo and under the carts. Somehow this made them certain we weren't assassins, smugglers, or whoever else they'd been ordered to detain. It occurred to me that this type of security is infrequent for Kina and likely a response to the conflict with the Night Kingdom. I see. The reason that the guards didn't detain us or perform a more thorough inspection is likely because we aren't drow. I wonder how long the line would have been if we had been at war with Bolisir or the Empire of Calcuti. One of the blatantly newer guards had done a double take when he saw Nick, but thankfully a veteran guard was on duty and was able to put two and two together. Nick's presence could have been another reason we weren't more thoroughly inspected. There's a decent chance they've been told of him and what he's doing for High Chief Ulamak. There's not a guard alive who would risk angering the High Chief. Almost there, Imlaw said cheerily. Awesome, Nick sighed in relief. I could use a shower. The inn has me spoiled. Not sure the inn is to blame for that, Nash chuckled. Olmira and I smiled, remaining silent. Neither of us had been overly social since our emotionally charged conversation days prior. The discussion had ended on a happy note, and it would seem that we are afraid of souring things. The both of us are notoriously terrible at tiptoeing around emotions that we don't quite understand. There could be another reason for our awkward silences, though. I meant every word that I had said during the conversation, of course, but I had conveniently left out how hurt I felt that she hadn't confided in me. Over her years of tutelage, we had become each other's confidants. I told her of my deepest, darkest secrets, and in exchange she had told me many secrets that were much more embarrassing and compromising than the fact that she was a fair folk, reborn as a vampire. So why did she feel the need to hide her true origin from me? Unfortunately, I could not think of any reasons that were particularly flattering for either of us. No matter, I've endeavored to forgive the matter. It is difficult to cope with these feelings, but as with any other challenge, I'll manage. The cart continued through the city while Nash and Nick debated what we should do after seeing Ulamak. We shouldn't get back on the road right away, Nash said sternly. Need at least a week to do all the relevant research. Research? What research? Nick demanded. All we need is a day or two to replenish our supplies and find transportation, then we go. It's not as if we're going on an expedition into the wastes or anything. Oh? And you know what to expect when we get to Calcuti, do you? Then tell me, are there tolls or security concerns that we need to bear in mind? Will every city or village there allow us to carry our weapons openly, or will we need to account for being unable to do so? How's the weather? If there's a chill, will we need cold weather gear, or will we be able to get some on the way? And furthermore, which fucking city are we traveling to? Nash is right, I interjected. There is plenty of research to be done on our destination and the route. But we didn't have to wait a week to go to Bolisir. That's because we had a set destination in mind and familiarity with the locale. I lived in Bolisir for a while, remember? He fell silent as Nash and I shared a knowing look. His urgency was easily understood, as was his inexperience with this particular lifestyle. It doesn't matter how welcome this world makes him feel. It isn't home, and it doesn't have his love in it. My thoughts wandered to what I would do to have Rira back in my life. We hadn't even got as far as Nick and Cass, yet if there were a chance to bring her back to life, I'd stop at almost nothing. I know that Nash feels the same about Nima. Nick sighed as the cart pulled into the walkway behind Imlaw's shop. We dragged our road-weary bodies from the cart, grabbing our belongings as we went. Imlaw approached us and tossed Nash a sack of coins. "There we are, safe and sound," the gnome grinned. "I couldn't have found better guards anywhere else. If you ever need more work, let me know. It won't be me driving the carts, though." "Thanks," Nash said. "Hope you enjoy being off the road from now on." "Oh, I will," Imlaw laughed, then turned to face Nick. "Words cannot express my gratitude, Nick. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. I'm able to come home to my wife and children. If it weren't for you, I'd have—" Imlaw trailed off, trying to maintain his composure as the emotions that he'd been suppressing swelled within him. Nick gently placed his hand on the gnome's shoulder. "It's the least I can do for a friend," Nick said. Nash and I shared another knowing glance. While it seemed heartfelt, what Nick had said sounded somewhat rehearsed, almost as if he had repeatedly practiced saying it in a mirror. Imlaw didn't notice this and grabbed Nick's hand, shaking it. "Of course," he said, wiping his eyes with his other hand. "I'll consider you my friend for the rest of my life. If you ever need anything, let me know how I can help." "Of course. Goodbye, Imlaw," Nick smiled. "Stay safe." "You too, friend. Farewell, everyone." "Bye," I waved. "Try not to worry your wife anymore." "See you around," Nash said. Elmira simply waved as Imlaw entered his home. The four of us took our leave and began walking toward Kina's capital building. As we traveled, we heard snippets of several interesting conversations. "The dwarves eat like swarmfish," an elf said to his friend. "It's a good thing we had a decent haul this season, or we'd be facing a famine." "No, the bastards brought their own smiths. They have no need of my services," an orcish smith explained to a customer. "Have you seen how shiny their weapons are? I want a sword like that," a small child exclaimed to her friends as we passed. "I guess the Empire of Calcuti sent reinforcements," Nash said. "That's got to be awkward." "Yeah," Nick laughed. "Should we see if we can travel with them?" "It would likely be marching," I added. "I'd rather take a cart if it's all the same to you." "I'm sure there's someone with a cart that's going to want to travel along with the army. It would be a lot safer for them," Nick said. "Let's face the music with High Chief Ulamak and then ask around." "Face the music?" I asked. "Yeah, sorry. It's a phrase that means to accept the unfavorable consequences of your actions." "How?" Nash laughed. "Is music that bad where you're from?" "No," Nick chuckled. "It's one of those phrases that nobody knows where it comes from. Some people think it comes from plays where an orchestra is set up in front of a stage, so the actors have to face the music and overcome their stage fright. I've also heard that it could be referring to a time when military units had drummers and horns, so you'd need to face the music to attack your enemy." "Opposite ends of the civilization spectrum," I said. "Interesting." The conversation died down as the Capitol building came into view. One of the guards noticed us approaching and pointed a thumb at the door, informing us of our ability to pass him unhindered. We nodded our thanks at him and did so, and were immediately greeted by Rezun. "We've been expecting you," he said. "Good work on delivering the message to Regent Oakmore." "Thanks," Nash said. "So, any word on how the High Chief is taking the news about the High Dragon?" "No," Rezun answered with a mischievous grin. "I suppose you'll have to ask him yourself. He'll be ready for you soon." "Great," Nick whispered. Rezun escorted us to a waiting area, and we each took a seat. Nash and Nick seemed to be a lot more nervous than Elmira and I. Nash was leaning forward in his chair, arms crossed and leg bobbing up and down. Nick was also leaned forward, staring at his hands that were clasped in front of him. "They look like a couple of miscreants who were just caught," I whispered to Elmira. Her giggle brought a smile to my face. Despite my slightly injured pride, I found myself still enjoying her company. I suppose in the end that's what it boiled down to. I was proud of being her confidant and proud of my ability to cope with unexpected information. Finding out that she had been hiding such a big secret from me shattered the pride that I felt as her confidant, which in turn hurt the pride I take in coping with unexpected information. I looked around the waiting area and chuckled at how inappropriate a time it was to be having this revelation. "Why are they so nervous?" Ulmira asked softly. "They must be under the impression that Ulamak's going to be angry that King Isinirath has awakened." "Yes, I know. I mean, what cause would Ulamak have to be angered?" "Well, Isinirath could end up being a threat to the unified chiefdoms if he decides not to honor agreements that he didn't personally sign or approve of. Plus, it's no secret that Regent Oakmore and Ulamak are close friends. So Ulamak could also be upset that his friend has been demoted." "I see." Ulmira's demeanor changed slightly, causing me to chuckle again. Nervousness will change nothing in situations that are outside of one's control. What happens will happen, regardless of whether or not one worries about it. I was about to tell her as much when the door opened and Rezun entered. "They are ready for you," he said. Nash and Nick practically leapt from their seats, but I took a second to adjust my robes before rising. Then I realized something and looked at Rezun quizzically. "They?" I asked. Chapter 59. Emperor Jak Norev First. Adventurer level, not applicable, dwarf, Calcutin. Raisin's introduction took nearly 10 minutes to complete, and most of that was because of my propensity for collecting titles. Ulamak and Ulmira had nearly as many, but I guess that makes sense for the ruler of another nation and a multi-centuries-old vampire. Ulmira looked the same as the last time I'd laid eyes on her, nearly 30 years prior. Lyeth had a decent number of titles, which is to be expected of his exploits. Conversely, the orcs from the Alta family had barely any titles, and the human didn't have a single one. I struggled not to stare at him for the entire introduction and succeeded for the most part. A couple of glances here and there managed to wiggle past my self-control, though. The human's an odd-looking thing. His hands and general shape are similar to what I imagine a tall gnome might look like. But that's where the similarities to gnomes end. It has a jawline nearly identical to that of an elf, and some of its teeth look like a drow's. On top of that, its musculature is similar to an orc's, though orcs tend to be a bit larger. The most shocking detail to me, though, is that it also has the round earlobes that you only see in dwarves. I would easily believe that he's an amalgamation of the various races, were it not for the roundness of the top of his ears and his alleged origin. An alien from another world, magically teleported here, parts unknown. Despite his earlier evasiveness, a little pressing had caused Ulamak to practically gush various facts about the human. A refreshing bit of candor from High Chief See for Yourself, Ulamak. The human eats both meat and vegetables, which is odd enough, though I could have guessed at this fact by its teeth. Even odder, though, is that it has thus far leveled up far faster than normal. This could be indicative of either an advanced education or the Kuraguard showing favoritism outside of a royal line for the first time in history. Finally, it had killed a monster that nearly destroyed a team of over 20s. A monster that may have been a corrupted version of its own race. The look on my face at hearing that last fact had caused Ulamak's caginess to return. I glanced at Lyeth, who was also studying the human. He had met it before, but desperately wanted to know how it awoke King Isinirath. The dwarven, not-quite spy had practically begged me to allow him to accompany me. In exchange for an unnamed future favor, I had allowed it. Once Rezun finished his overly long introduction, the four in front of us began their debriefing. I listened in disbelief as they recounted their travels. The story was primarily told by the Alta brothers, and the human, Ulmira, had joined their party on the latter portion of the journey. The human spoke with an eloquence that could rival that of a duke, but with far less profanity than is typical in my empire. This lent credence to the idea that he had been educated. But by whom? What kind of teacher would educate a being like this without simultaneously turning him into a research project? Despite his eloquence and formalities, though, his story was full of holes and time skips that indicated it was likely trying to hide something. This was further evidenced by Nick wringing his hands when an obvious omission occurred during the narrative. I could tell by the tension slowly creeping into Ulamak's shoulders that I wasn't the only one who noticed. Once the translators arrived, we made our way back here to report to you, High Chief, the human said. Ulamak crossed his arms. I confess that I do not know you well, Nick, but I suspect that the events you just elucidated have been heavily redacted. There were some happenings that were not relevant to the mission. Your greatness, Yulk said, bowing his head. Happenings that are rather sensitive to our charge, I'm afraid. And how am I to know for certain these happenings are irrelevant when I am not to know of what they are? Teasing does not befit one of your station, High Chief, Olmyra the Eternal said, crossing her arms to match Ulamak's posture. Consider the likelihood that the altars would endanger the United Chiefdoms. The massive orc and domineering vampire stared at one another for a few moments. I'd argued with the both of them before, but hadn't seen them argue among themselves. I absent-mindedly rubbed the thick golden hoop in my left earlobe as I tried to guess who would give ground first. Everyone else in the room looked as if they'd been shown their graves, though. After a few seemingly tense moments, Ulamak laughed uproariously, which caused a few flinches. I knew you'd spoil my fun the moment you walked in, Olmyra. She's right, boys. I'm having a bit of levity at your expense, he explained. I am content to let you have your secrets so long as they don't come back to bite me on the rump. They won't, sir. Nick trailed off. Wait, you don't plan to attack the fair folk any time soon, do you? What? No, Ulamak answered incredulously. First of all, the only fair folk we're aware of are on good terms with us. Second, it would be a damned foolish thing to do, regardless of our relationship with them. They help keep the monster population manageable. Third, how in the hells do you know about the fair folk? The Alta brothers sighed simultaneously, whilst the human attempted to fabricate a plausible explanation. The explanation carefully dodged the reasons that the group had met with the fair folk, as well as some of the crucial details that had been discussed during that meeting. The only real detail he gave were the names of the fair folk involved, which caused me to involuntarily snort. Ulamak looked over his shoulder at me. Once he met my gaze, he smirked and rolled his eyes. Then he turned back to Nick and the orcs with a much sterner expression. Well, I've never heard of Algebrun or Tits, but Mummeldobran is a name that I know well. It is a representative of the fair folk of the deep wild forest, most of which is within the domain of the unified chiefdoms, Ulamak explained. We have a great many agreements with the fair folk of the deep wild forest. It would not be an exaggeration to say that a threat to them is a threat to us. Well, High Chief, they seemed confident that they have the situation under control, Nick said. That is not for you to decide, but I can see you are determined to keep this secret. Well then, let's try this. Ulamak clapped his massive hands. Yulk Alta, by the authority of the office of the High Chief of the United Chiefdoms, I hereby order you to tell me of your journey in full, unadulterated detail. Failure to comply will result in your arrest and a punishment of up to 15 years in prison. What about his mum? Lyeth asked. Oh, she'll understand, Ulamak said. The Alta clan is mostly law-abiding and very honorable. By refusing this order, Yulk will be breaking the law. She may protest, perhaps even smack me upside the head, but she'll take no action to prevent his incarceration. I understand, sir, Yulk said calmly. I invoke the right of confidence. The right of confidence is an orc law passed by Ulamak's grandfather. It allows one to refuse to answer questions that may compromise the security of the unified chiefdoms in the presence of one who may reveal those secrets to an enemy. My rage was immediate and blinding. What in the hells is that supposed to mean? I demanded. You think I can't be trusted with your little secrets? I'm an emperor. I know secrets that would cause the hair to flee from your head, boy. My apologies for the insult, Emperor. Your Highness is not the reason for my invocation, though. My temper cooled as Yulk looked pointedly at the dwarf to my left. Lyeth chuckled and stood up, brushing off his pants. Fair enough, he said. I'll see myself out. Hold on, Ulamak said, holding up a hand. The right of confidence is non-applicable. Lyeth is an official friend of the unified chiefdoms. If what you're about to say can be said in front of the Emperor, it can be said in front of Lyeth. No offense, Emperor. Some taken, I growled. But he sells information, Nash argued before realizing his blunder. Before Ulamak could chastise him, Lyeth laughed. That I do, Nash, but I've got honor. Of a sort. If a friend swears me to secrecy, it will be a secret that I keep. There was a moment of silence as Yulk contemplated how to proceed. Understood, he finally said. As Leith sat down, Yulk began to tell us what actually happened during their journey. We listened intently to the entirety of the tale of gods and fae in shock. A spark of paranoia lit within me when I learned that Nick is touched, but I quickly quelled it. It isn't as if there's much harm in the gods watching us, and the only methods of trying to prevent their surveillance would only guarantee their ire. The ire of the gods is obviously best avoided at all costs. Still, I didn't feel happy about it. And once the messengers left, we made our way here, Yulk said. Well, I can see why you decided to keep that a secret. Ulamak uncrossed his arms. However, it is a good thing you told me. I've got an inkling as to who may attack the Fairfolk, and there might be something we can actually do about it. The Night Kingdom is the most likely culprit. Lofin's dumb enough to try a sneak attack against the Fairfolk, but he'd likely fail due to the typical incompetency of his armies. The vampires, on the other hand, are crafty enough to succeed, and are likely desperate. There might be indeed, I said, rubbing my chin. All right, I think that's enough, Ulamak said. You four are on your way to Calcuti now, right? Yes, High Chief, Yulk said. Liath, did you come by Hanas or cart? He came by cart. Since I was expecting a fight, I came by Hanas, I answered, glaring at the spoiled dwarf. I only know how to drive a Hanas, Your Eminence. Liath held up his hands defensively. I've never ridden one before. So you say. It is good that you arrived by cart, Ulamak interrupted. You can depart the same way and give these four a ride into Calcuti, unless the Emperor has an objection. No objections from me. Just keep your noses clean while you're in my country, I said with a wave of my hand. A knock came from the door, and Rezun poked his head in. Ulamak nodded at him. The elves have arrived. General Makiv is waiting to see you. He'll not have to wait long. Yulk, Nash, Olmyra, Nick, and Liath, you're dismissed. Safe journeys. Liath raised an eyebrow but followed the rest out of the room. I sighed, having figured out what's coming next. Simple math, really. We have one dwarven army, an orcish army, an elven army, and a mutual enemy to the north. Rezun entered the office with General Makiv in tow. It had been a long time since I'd seen the elven general, and unlike Olmyra, he had aged. His hair was a lighter color, and there was a slight crinkle around his eyes. It reminded me of my own forthcoming golden years. Introductions won't be necessary this time, Rezun, Ulamak said with a wave of his hand. How are you, Makiv? I'm great. It's been a while since I was on the road, the general said as Rezun left. Wish you'd let him do the intro, though. I've got a new title. Oh? Dragon's General, on account of King Isinirath's awakening. I only just learned about it the other day, Makiv laughed. An excellent title. Well, I assume my messenger told you of the fate of the Drow invasion. Indeed he did, Makiv took a seat. However, my men need fed and watered, so we finished our trek regardless. And since we're here, I had an idea. Lead an invasion into the Night Kingdom and force Lofin into a lasting treaty, I asked with a smirk. Yes, Emperor. I take it you're of a similar mind? No, I'd rather raze that damned country to the ground and split the land evenly amongst us. We can decide what to do with the Night Kingdom's holdings once we beat it, Ulamak chuckled. But first, we have an invasion to plan. Chapter 60. Galimorathi, Adventurer Level 13 Dwarf, Calcutin. I don't fucking get it, Rebus said while rubbing his temples. Isn't this a dead dungeon? Apparently not, Heino replied. Travelers have gone missing nearby, and the only thing the disappearances have in common is tracks that lead back to this dungeon. We stared at the mausoleum that marked the entrance of the Talacum dungeon for a moment. Rebus wasn't wrong. Until a few days ago it had been classified as neutralized and looted. Then some newbie adventurer went looking for his missing cousin and found some blood and a ripped pack. Then followed some tracks back here. It's probably for the best that he immediately turned tail and reported it to the Venator's Bureau. Our party is contracted to the Venator's Bureau and is currently comprised of 5 members. Mako, an orc from the Unified Chiefdoms, who's large enough to make a Nahalim pause. Ithrima, an elven sorceress that's been with the party for about half a decade now. Then there's Rebis, Haino, and myself. All three of us are dwarves from the western fringe of Kalkuti and founding members of our locally famous group, the Western Wasters. I absolutely hate our name. It's supposed to indicate the fact that we originate from the western portion of Kalkuti and that we are willing to go into the wastes. To me, the name makes it sound like we're a bunch of drunks. Unfortunately, the one who coined the name died slowly and painfully because of consumption. It was sad enough to make us to stick with the dumbest fucking name of all time. "What do you think, Gali?" Mako asked. "This gonna be an easy one?" "Bah," I replied. "How should I fucking know? Don't got anything to base that kind of judgment off of. Last reported monster in this fucker was kobolds, but kobolds don't do kidnappings. Hell, they don't even like going above ground." Mako shifted, his heavy armor clinking as he hefted his pike casually onto his shoulder. The rest of the party also fidgeted nervously. Nobody liked it when I couldn't tell how dangerous something was going to be. It's probably just luck, but I've never been wrong. Might also have something to do with the fact I don't venture a guess unless I've got something to go off of. Well, I guess it's not like I've got nothing. A dungeon supposedly filled with lower-tier monsters suddenly becomes a hideout for kidnappers. The entrance to said dungeon is a fucking grave marker, and I can smell death from all the way out here. There's no chance this is going to be a safe quest. Fuck it, I sighed. I'm going to say it's probably life-threatening. So let's just do what the Bureau asked and take a peek, yeah? Sounds good to me, Rebis said, attaching his shield to his arm. It's all they're fucking paying us for anyway. Come now, Rebis, Ithrima scolded. We don't do this for the pay. We do this to make things safer for the citizenry of the Empire of Kalkuti. Ithrima was the most patriotic of our ragtag group. To her, being an adventurer was a calling, not a job. Can't say that I entirely disagree, but I'm far more concerned with being able to eat than whether or not some fool is sleeping safely in his bed. Listen, bitch, the citizenry of Kalkuti is safest when I've got a good brew in my belly, Rebis replied, and it ain't like they're buy-in. So really, to ensure their safety, they should be paying me loads. You sound like a bandit, Shortstack, she growled. Rebis, Haino, and I began glaring at her once the slur left her mouth. She instantly realized her mistake and her eyes locked onto the ground. I'm sorry. You're goddamned right you are, Haino said. Gali and I didn't call you a bitch, did we? So what the fuck are you doing using our height as an insult? It's not even a good insult, Mako said. There's a lot of advantages to being dwarf-sized. I said I'm sorry, Ithrima shouted. Fine, I'll change my insult to cousin fucker. You happy? That'll do for me, I said. Yep, Haino nodded. Much better, Mako grinned. Hey, fuck all of you, Rebis scowled. Now, Rebis, we're not your cousins, Ithrima said with a wicked smile. Rebis glared at her for a moment, but couldn't come up with a comeback. Instead, he drew his sword and started angrily marching toward the dungeon. We fucking doing this or not? He asked over his shoulder. The four of us chuckled and started following after him. Haino, who also wields a sword and board, chased after him to share point. Mako took his place between them, not having to run because of his long legs. In his armor, our orc's damn near untouchable head-on. But since he uses a pike, he's vulnerable to attacks from the side. Haino and Rebis cover his flanks with their shields and swords, while Ithrima and I handle ranged attacks and healing when it's needed. It's a tried-and-true formation that's led us safely through many fights. But the moment we crossed the threshold of the dungeon, a knot formed in my gut. The smell of death was almost overpowering now. There's corpses somewhere, and probably a lot of them. Gods, I hate being right. We activated our lights, and I nervously checked my string and quiver. The soft twang of the string echoed in the dungeon, causing me to wince slightly. Everyone else looked at me with a raised eyebrow, and I sighed softly at my rookie mistake. We continued forward, and I noticed Ithrima fiddling with her ring. It had been given to her by her husband to mark their engagement, and it became her arcane focus after he was killed by a warg. His death is what made her want to become an adventurer. She only plays with the ring when she's thinking about him, or when she's nervous. It felt good to know that I wasn't the only one. Both the floor and the walls were tiled, apparently by magic. The lack of tool marks was a dead giveaway. Mako started poking the tiles in front of us as we went, and eventually his pike found a trap. Once the trap withdrew, he pointed out which tile was its trigger, and we stepped past it. We didn't get far before Mako stopped again. "Damn, that's gross," Mako said softly, poking his spear at something. "What is it?" I asked. "Dead kobolds," Rebis said. "Looks like they've been here for a while." Hino held his nose and knelt to get a closer look. "They sure have. The flesh is pretty rotten. This one's neck. I could swear that's a handprint." Mako knelt down, took a look, then nodded solemnly. "Yeah, that's definitely a handprint. Those ones were cut, though. So 2 of them? One with a blade and one strong enough to crush a kobold's neck bare-handed." "I don't know." Hino held out his hand and compared it to the neck. "Pretty sure that's a left hand. Might have been only one attacker, blade in their right hand and grabbing with their left. There's a lot of things that use blades when they don't have to," Rebis added as Hino and Mako stood. "Even some adventurers do that." "True," Hino shrugged. "Guess we still don't know what we're dealing with." With the mystery left unsolved, we continued on, hoping to find more clues as to what we were dealing with. It wasn't long before we did find more clues, but they were in the form of several more groups of kobold bodies. We stopped to examine each one, and our findings grew grimmer as we went. "It's like whoever did this was just playing with them," Hino said solemnly. "I don't get how you make it through this many kobolds without getting a wound or two that'll make you hesitant." "What do you mean?" Mako asked. "This one's got a spear next to it, but also has a handprint on its neck. Would you try to go hand to hand with someone holding a spear?" "No. The whole point of a spear is to make people keep their distance." "Hold on, this one's got a bite mark on its shoulder," Rebis said. Hino jogged over to him and examined the dead kobold. I fought the temptation to join them. "Tell me this isn't what I think it is, Hino. It only looks like that because of the rot, right?" Rebis asked. "Oh no," Hino replied. "What is it?" Mako asked. The bulking orc joined the pair of dwarves and examined the corpse. The 3 of them went uncharacteristically quiet. Ithrima and I shared an annoyed glance. "Well, don't keep us in suspense," I growled. "The fuck did you find?" The 3 of them stood. "There's no doubt about it," Mako said. "This is a vampire bite." "A vampire?" I scoffed. "Here, and since when do vampires snack on kobolds?" "Since when are you a fucking expert on vampires, Galai?" Rebis rebutted. "Since your mom taught me last night, she sucked just as—" "The Night Kingdom has vamps," Mako interrupted with a sigh. "Heard that the chiefdoms were fighting them again this year. Could be one came through the chiefdoms with the drow army." "No, that doesn't make sense," Ithrima said. "Drow can't become vampires, and there's a mutual hatred there that runs deep. They wouldn't have let a vampire accompany them, and if anyone could spot a vampire, it would be a drow." "I wouldn't give the drow in Lofin's army too much credit," Hino added. "Heard they're dumber than the sticks they carry." "Yeah, if there were any drow that would get fooled by a vamp, it would be their soldiers," Rebis scoffed. "Doesn't matter how it got here, though. That's definitely a bloodsucker bite. Nothing else with teeth like that has hands, and this kobold's throat was crushed like the other ones." Nobody said anything as we contemplated how a vampire bite could have ended up on the dead kobold. After a few moments of silence, Mako shrugged, and the rest of us took that as a signal to form up. Ultimately, Rebis was right. It really doesn't matter how it happened, only that it has. I glanced at Ithrima, knowing she would be crucial in the coming fight. Vampires are legendarily difficult to put down, pretty much have to burn the flesh right off their bones. Ideally, you'd ash the bones in the process. I assumed that the 3 in front knew how to fight vampires, then remembered an age-old saying about assumptions. "So, has any of us fought vamps before?" I asked. "No, but I've been taught," Mako said. "Pin 'em down, let the mage burn 'em." "It'll be easier if you stick 'em and me or Hino lobs their head off," Rebis added. "Then we put the bits in a pile and have Ithrima do the whoosh. Which leaves me with the task of filling the vampire full of enough arrows to slow it down enough for Mako to get his pike in deep. Good thing I brought the barb heads. Couple of gut shots or a lucky hit to the legs should do the trick." We continued down the dungeon, avoiding traps and piles of dead kobolds. Our footfalls echoed softly, almost rhythmically. But something was off with that rhythm. Mako held up his hand, and we immediately stopped, readying ourselves for a fight. "Here it comes," the big-ass orc said. I pulled back the string on my bow and moved to get a clear line of sight down the hall. I steadied my breathing and waited for whatever was running toward us to come into view. The sound of footsteps didn't stop and grew louder as we waited. Breathe in, pat, 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 pat. Breathe out, pat, 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 pat. Wait. Pat, pat is the vampire barefoot. Before the thought could fully construct itself, a kobold came into view. Upon seeing us ready to tear it apart, it flung itself to the ground and threw up its hands. The sounds of its whimpers replaced its footsteps. "No hurts, please, no fights," it said. Look, I got no pokies or slashes. I just a word bringer." The tension in my bow and jaw slackened at the same time. The tension in the rest of the party evaporated as well. I almost laughed. We'd been expecting a grueling fight with a vampire, and were instead greeted by an unarmed kobold survivor. "A word bringer?" Rebis asked. "What word do you bring, lizard?" "I not lizard, I kobold," it said stubbornly. "I eat lizard." "Aren't kobolds cannibalistic?" Heino asked. "Dunno that word." "We're wasting time. The vamp could be behind it," I said. "Speak, kobold, quickly." Yes. The Lord wants you to be word bringers and tell the, shitty people that there are vampires in here." The kobold rose to his knees and looked at us expectantly. "You mean city people?" I said that. "Wait, did he say vampires?" Mako asked, "as in more than one?" "More than I can count, and me count real good," the kobold nodded excitedly. "Best counter now that Thyrsis is dead, all the way to 7. The 5 of us froze. 1 vampire would be a hard fight. 2 would damn near kill us. 3 would guarantee a couple of us would die. More than 7 would mean that all of us would die and become vampires without even putting up a fight. "Fuck that," Rebis said. "Time to go." We all turned in unison and began to leave the dungeon. The patter of bare feet trailed after us. I turned to face the kobold as we continued to walk. "The hell are you doing?" I asked. "Coming with," the kobold said, as if it were confused by the question. The 5 of us looked at each other as we walked, and each of us took a turn shrugging. "Yeah, all right then," I said. "Come on."